Section 13 of Amurath to Amurath. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Read by Claire. Amurath to Amurath by Gertrude Bell. Baghdad to Mosul. Continued. We rode northwards for 8 hours and camped at Tel Gayara, near to which there are some small pitch springs. The land of Assyria grew ever more fertile as we journeyed up into it, and that night the horses were picketed knee-deep in grass, to the boundless satisfaction of the muleteers. I was anxious on the following day to visit Nimrud, the Assyrian city mentioned in Genesis as Calah, but in order to do so it was necessary to find a ferry across the Tigris, which was a doubtful undertaking. Even if it were found, the flood might make ferryboats unprofitable vessels. Therefore, I detached Fatu from the caravan and bade him ride with Azapta and me, Fatu being master of 1,000 wiles with which to baffle difficulty, and possessor forby of a remarkably strong right arm. We rode in 2 hours to Mangub, where there are a few ruined huts. On the opposite bank of the Tigris, a number of mounds mark the site of ancient villages. The grass grew thick by the river, and on the higher ground it had also sprouted abundantly, though it was now withered. Presently we spied upon the path in front of us an effendi on horseback, who carried a big umbrella to protect himself from the sun. His state was further enhanced by the presence of a few zaptas. "He is coming to Gayara," said my soldier. "They have sent him from Mosul to judge a dispute about the crops. 4 men were murdered last week at Gayara, and 10 are lying fatally wounded." This was news to me. I had been peacefully unconscious of the dead and dying as I watched my horses knee-deep in the grass. The effendi, when he came up to us, addressed me as follows. "Bonjour, madame. Comment aimez-vous le désert?" "Mais beaucoup," said I, somewhat astonished to hear the French tongue spoken in it, and then I added quickly, "What tidings have you from Constantinople?" The effendi drew his brows together. "We hear that troops from Salonika have entered the town and captured 2 barracks." "Did they take them without difficulty?" I asked. "We do not know," he returned. "Please God," said I. "Adieu," he replied hurriedly, and rode upon his way. In those days of uncertainty it was not wise to be drawn into a definite expression of opinion. Our road took us up a ridge, and when we came to its crest I drew bridle, for the history of Asia was spread out before my eyes. Below us the great Zab flowed into the Tigris. Here Tissaphernes murdered the Greek generals. Here Xenophon took over the command, and having crossed the Zab at a higher point, turned and drove back the archers of Mithridates. To the north the mound of Nimrud, where the Greeks saw the ruins of Calah, stood out among the cornfields. Eastward lay the plains of Arbela, where Alexander overthrew Darius. The whole world shone like a jewel, green corn, blue waters, and the gleaming snows that bound Mesopotamia to the north. But to my ears the smiling landscape cried out a warning. The people of the West can conquer, but they can never hold Asia. No, not when they go out under the banners of Alexander himself. We rode up the bank of the Tigris, and when we came opposite to Tel Nimrud, there, by good fortune, was a ferryboat plying across the river with the men and flocks of the Jabur. The cause of their migration to the left bank was hopping about our feet, locusts newly issued from the rocky ground and swarming over every blade of grass and corn. "In 2 days there will be no pasture and our flocks will die," explained an aged shepherd. "Let the consul cross," he shouted as the ferryboat drew up beside the bank and half the tribe clambered into it. We ejected 2 calves, a mare, and a few goats and installed ourselves in their place. The ferryboat was as tightly packed as the ark and the passengers nearly as varied. They all talked, whinnied, baaed, and bleated at once as we pushed out into the swift stream. I climbed onto the back of my mare, which seemed the cleanest and the roomiest spot, and we busied ourselves in catching locusts and throwing them into the water, for alas, they had embarked with us by the 100. The mound of Nimrud, when I saw it, lay in a waving sea of corn. The holes and pits of Layard's diggings were filled to the brim with grass and flowers, and the ziggurat of the war god Ninib reared its bare head out of a field of poppies. But except for the flowers, Nimrud, whence we obtained many of the treasures of our museum in London, is a pitiful sight for English eyes. Its neglected state stands in sharp contrast with the pious care which the German excavators are expending upon the ruins of Ashur. Carved and inscribed blocks have been left exposed to the malicious attacks of Arab boys, who hold it a meritorious act to deface an idol, and to the even slenderer mercy of the winter rains and frosts. In one place a stone statue projects head and shoulders out of the ground, the face of the king or god which it represents being already terribly battered. The number of Assyrian statues known to us is exceedingly small. Not more than 7 or 8 have been brought to light, yet this splendid example is allowed to fall into decay for want of a handful of earth wherewith to cover it. The city of Kala is associated with some of Layard's most memorable triumphs. For the sake of our own honor, it would be well that we should take steps to preserve the works of art that remain in it, and that if we cannot find money to transport them to the museum at Constantinople, we should at least employ a few men to rebury them until more enthusiastic archaeologists turn their attention to Nimrud. Sheikh Askar of the Jabur, who had accompanied me from his tents by the river, listened sympathetically while I lamented over the statue, and volunteered to bury it under the earth as soon as his men should have brought over their flocks from the west bank. I applauded the suggestion and encouraged it with bakshish, but unless I am much mistaken, the Sheikh's resolve has not yet reached the point of execution. We sat in his tent while we waited for the ferry boat, and with eager hospitality he set before us coffee, bread, and a mess of apricots. It was the last Arab coffee fire that was to be lighted in our honor. So we ferried back, climbed a bluff alive with locusts, and cantered through sweet-smelling crops to the sulphur springs of Hammam Ali. A few minutes beyond the village, our tents were pitched in deep, luxuriant grass. We struck camp next morning with an agreeable sense of excitement. Mosul was only 4 hours away, and the advantage of city life, consulates, rest from travel, news of the outer world, shone very brightly before us. The rising sun, the dewy cornfields, the flowering grass lent their enchantment to our breakfast, and gaily we stepped out upon the road. Before us lay a little ridge that separated us from Mosul. We had journeyed towards it for half an hour when there fell upon our ears a sound that made our hearts stand still. It was the boom of a cannon. Said Fatou, "What is that?" But none of us could answer. We went on through the smiling, sunny landscape and the green corn, where the peasants stood by the irrigation trenches, their work suspended, their faces turned towards that ominous sound, and presently we met an old man. He too listened. "Why are they firing cannon in Mosul?" I asked. "God knows," he answered, and wrung his hands together. "Perhaps it is news from Stamboul. One man says one thing and one another, and God knows what is true." A little further a ragged pair came down the road toward us. "When did you set out from Mosul?" said Fatou. "At the first dawn," they answered, and fear was in their eyes. "What was happening there?" asked Fatou. "Nothing," they replied. "When we set out, Wallah, there was nothing." We left them standing in the road with anxious faces turned towards the town, and still the cannon boomed over the hill. "Mosul is an evil city," said Fatou to the Zabtai. "It is evil," he answered. "Blood flows there like water of the Tigris." After a few minutes, 2 Arabs galloped up behind us on their mares, and one carried a great lance. "Whither going?" cried Fatou. "To Mosul," they shouted. "What is your business?" he called out. "We heard the cannon," they replied, and galloped up the hill. The Zabta went with them. "He will be little use if Mosul is up," observed Fatou. At this moment the cannon ceased, and we saw a party of 4 or 5 soldiers riding over the brow. The Arabs and my Zabta stopped to speak to them, and then turned back with them, coming slowly towards us down the ridge. "These know," said Fatou. They stopped when they reached us, and the moment was big with fate. "Peace be upon you," they said. "And upon you, peace," I returned. "What is the news?" And one answered, "Rashad is Sultan." "God prolong his existence," said I. Upon this we parted, and they went down the hill, and we in silence to the top of the ridge. The silver Tigris and the green plain lay before us, and in the midst of the city of Mosul, which had published the accession of another lord. "Praise God," said I, looking down upon that fair land. "To him the praise," echoed Fatou. And then the Zabta gave voice to his thought. "All the days of Abdul el-Hamid," he said, "we never drew our pay." The ruins of Samarra. The ruined mosque at Samarra has an interior measurement of 240 by 157.6 meters, the greater length being from north to south. The 4 angle towers are larger in diameter than those which are set along the walls. The intermediate bastions are perfectly regular in size and shape except the 2 on either side of the southern gate, from which a segment is cut off by the door openings, and the bastion immediately to the west of the same gate, which has a small addition to the western part of its curve, an addition which I do not believe to be later in date, though the brickwork is of slightly different character. The southern gate is a triple opening in the middle of the wall, where it would be natural to look for the mihrab, figure 138. There are remains of moldings round the inner face of the central opening, figure 139. The upper part of the south wall is pierced by 24 windows, 2 of them being placed over the smaller openings of the central gateway, figure 122. These windows, together with the trenches in the interior of the mosque, which mark the line of the columns, determine the number of the colonnades. There must have been 24, each one ending against the wall between the windows. The central aisle, which terminated at the main gate and was wider than the rest, was not provided with a window. The space between the colonnades was undoubtedly roofed with beams. The holes into which the large crossbeams were fitted can still be seen on the inner side of the south wall. The windows placed with regard to the aisles bear no relation to the position of the round bastions on the exterior of the wall. They break into them at haphazard, frequently impinging upon their sides, while in one instance a window is cut straight through a tower, Figure 120. On the inner face, the windows are covered by a cuspid arch, Figure 142. The east and west walls are broken by numerous doors. Beginning from the southern end, there is first a small entrance, 1.25 meters wide, close to the angle bastion, Figure 141. A wall about a meter in length projects from the main wall to the south of the door opening and has been connected with the top of the main wall by a section of vaulting. Immediately beyond this postern there is a large gateway 4.55 meters wide, and then another which is still larger, being 4.75 meters wide. The next door is 3.85 meters. The fifth, which is only 2.62 meters, is found in the west wall alone. Then follows another of the larger doors about 4 meters wide, beyond which there is, in the west wall only, a door 2.62 meters wide. Then on both sides a large door 4.05 meters wide and a small door 1.50 meters wide. The north wall is broken by 5 gates, the 2 at the outer ends averaging 1.5 meters and the other 3 4 meters in width. All the smaller doors exhibit an exceedingly curious piece of construction, Figure 140. The brickwork of the wall runs uninterruptedly over the door opening without the intermission of arch or lintel. It is as if the door had been cut out of the wall with a knife, and the bricks above it, so far as they keep their place, do so only by reason of the excellence of the mortar. The wall above the larger doors has in every case fallen away, but there is evidence of the former existence of some kind of lintel or arch strengthened by wood beams, the round holes for the beams being visible in the existing masonry, Figure 143. I incline to the theory of a lintel. The faced wall above the holes leaves no room for an arch. Above this lintel there would seem to have been a row of small arched windows, 2 or 3 in number. Cf. the 2 side openings of the south gate, where there is a single window above the arch. Along the top of the east, west, and north walls runs a brickwork decoration consisting of a series of recessed squares, each of which contains the recessed segment of a sphere. The walls are seamed from top to bottom with narrow runnels, which were no doubt connected with the drainage system of the roof. There is no unanimity of opinion among those who have planned the mosque concerning the number of the colonnades in the interior. As I have already said, it seems to me evident that there were 24 rows of columns or piers from east to west at the northern and southern ends of the mosque. I made out the colonnades to be 10 deep upon the south side and 3 deep upon the north, while upon the east and west sides I counted 4 rows of columns. The supports of the arcades must have been either columns or small piers, from the absence of any structural remains such as might have been expected if the supports had taken the form of brick piers. I incline, with Hertzfeld, to the view that the roof must have been carried on columns. Their total disappearance may possibly be accounted for by the fact that they were of wood, though Muqaddasi, writing at the end of the 10th century, relates that the mosque of Samarra was built upon marble columns, and his evidence cannot be wholly dismissed. In the center of the open court was placed in all probability the famous stone basin called the Kas-ir-Fir'aun, Pharaoh's cup, which is described by Mustafa. The minaret, with its singular spiral path, stands to the north of the mosque. The summit, though somewhat ruined, still retains a decoration of niches. There can be little doubt that the mosque is that which was erected by Mutawakkil, A.D. 847 to 861, to replace Mutamid's Friday Mosque, but Yaqut asserts that the minaret is a relic of Mutamid's foundation. Yaqut, however, wrote in 1225 when Samarra had long been in ruins. Next in importance to the mosque is the castle or palace on the opposite bank of the Tigris, known as the Ashik, Figure 145. The first time I visited it, we crossed in a gufa from a point a little below the town where there is usually a bridge of boats. The bridge had been swept away by the floods and the gufa landing was very bad. It was a full hour's ride up the river to El Ashik, but I was rewarded for my trouble by finding indubitable traces of a masonry bridge in the low ground almost exactly opposite a curious little building called Slabaya. My attention was called to the bridge by seeing men digging out the brick piers and arches for building material. The peasants told me that when the river is low, piers can be seen in the bed of the stream, and that the bridge ran in the direction of the Beit el Khalifa. I give this information for what it is worth. Yaqubi mentions a bridge of boats, ed de gauche, page 263. It is not impossible that pontoons may have been thrown across the deepest and swiftest part of the river and connected with the high ground on the west bank, which is at some distance from the stream by a series of masonry arches of which I saw the remains. The piers and arches would therefore have stood on ground which was under water in time of high flood. This is exactly the arrangement of the modern bridge at Mosul. The castle of the Ashik consists of a great enclosure 123 meters from north to south and 85 meters from east to west, surrounded by a wall with round bastions, which are set upon a rectangular base, figure 146. All the buildings that may have stood within the wall have vanished, but adjoining the north wall there are remains of a gatehouse consisting of 5 parallel chambers opening onto a corridor or platform. The chambers and the corridor are built upon a substructure of vaults. Under the corridor, the vaults run from east to west, except in the central part where the vault running from north to south is a continuation of the vault under the central chamber. Under the 5 chambers, all the vaults run from north to south. The vaults are built of flat tiles laid in slices against the head wall without centering. They have the usual small set forward from the wall, but in one case, perhaps in more than one, there is a slight divergence from the customary arrangement. From the spring of the vault, the tiles are laid horizontally for the first 16 or 17 courses, projecting forward so as to form a shallow curve. Above these horizontal courses, the tiles are laid upright and in slices. They form an ovoid curve more abrupt than the curve of the lower part of the vault. The 4th of the upper chambers, reckoning from east to west, is the best preserved. It shows the remains of a doorway 1.85 meters wide, covered on the same principle as the small doors of the mosques, i.e. without lintel or arch. A moat or trench runs all around the castle and passes to the north of the gatehouse. A bridge, of which small trace remains, connected the gatehouse with a rectangular outpost. To the north and east of this outpost there are fragments of a wall and towers which encompassed a rectangular area. The most interesting feature in the ruins is the niche decoration between the bastions of the north wall, figure 148. The niches have been in part filled up. No doubt they were found to be too dangerous a weakness to the wall, but their scheme is clearly apparent, figure 144. Each niche consisted of a high cuspid arch above a rectangular recessed panel which enclosed in turn a smaller arched niche. High up on the wall near the western angle tower there are traces of an upper order of niches. There is some indication that the niches were continued in the first north bay of the west wall, but the remainder of this wall together with the whole of the east wall is completely ruined. The disadvantage of these deep niches is evident in the south wall, where the niche has been broken through at its weakest point and has now the appearance of a door. In the 2 central towers on this side there seem to have been small flat-roofed chambers, figure 147. The building materials used in the castle are burnt and sun-dried brick. The foundations of the walls and towers, the vaulted substructures, the niched face of the north wall and its towers, together with what remains of the south wall and towers, are of burnt brick, but all the rest of the structure, including the partition walls of the gatehouse, are of sun-dried brick, and the same material is used to fill up the niches in the north wall. I rode northwards from the Ashik for exactly an hour to the ruins of Hu Wisilit, where there are traces of a wall set with towers. One tower alone stood to any height. It appeared to mark the northwest corner of a rectangular enclosure, in the center of which was a mound covered with fragments of tiles, but the east side of the enclosing wall was so completely destroyed that I could not make out the line of it. One important point is to be noted. The wall and towers were not built of brick, but of pebbles set in concrete, exactly similar to the masonry of the Khayyam Tower, and I think it possible that both Khayyam and Hu Wisilat may belong to an age prior to the Abbasid period. It must, however, be added that the gateway of the castle at Tikrit, which is undoubtedly Mohammedan, is built of the same materials. South of the Ashik is the ruin known as Kubet es Slabaya, figure 149. It consists of a small, square, central chamber, octagonal upon the exterior, encompassed by an octagonal corridor, figure 150. The central chamber has been covered by a dome, which was set on a simple bracket over the angles of the substructure, figure 151. The corridor had been barrel vaulted. Fragments of the transverse arches that helped to carry the vault are still in place. Slabaya was built of sun-dried brick covered with plaster. When I went to the Ashik for the second time, I sent a guffaw up the river to above Likwir and dropped downstream to the ruins of the castle, whence we floated down to the camp. On this most pleasant expedition I took occasion to examine Likwir. It lies about an hour's ride above Samara, and unlike all the other ruins, it is in the low ground by the water's edge. Its complete destruction is perhaps due to its having been at the mercy of the flooded river. Great blocks of fallen brickwork lie upon the bank and in the stream, while a massive brick wall forms a sort of quay. A large building must have adjoined this quay, for the ground is tossed into mounds for a considerable distance, and the mounds are strewn with broken brick and with fragments of thin marble slabs, pink, green, and grayish-white in color. The only other edifice which has escaped complete destruction is the Beit el Khalif, the House of the Caliph, figure 152. It is a triple-vaulted hall standing above the Tigris, figure 153. The central hall was no doubt the audience chamber of the palace. It corresponds to the great hall at Ctesiphon. The two wings are divided into a small antechamber covered with a semi-dome set on squinches, figure 154, and a larger room roofed with a barrel vault. The vaults are all slightly pointed and are all built on the Mesopotamian system, without centering and without a small corbelling forward from the wall. Under this outset there are a series of square holes as if for beams, though it is scarcely conceivable that beams can have been laid across the halls at this point. Round wooden poles were certainly used in the body of the walls. The wood has perished, leaving the round hole which it occupied. The windows or doors of the chambers on either side of the triple hall were covered without lintel or arch in the manner already described. The decoration of the palace must have been mainly of stucco, worked in relief or frescoed. Lying upon the ground were small fragments of plaster bearing a frescoed pattern of a simple kind, a row of circles outlined in red and yellow. A small piece of molded stucco is still attached to the inside of the arch over the opening of the central chamber, figure 155, and I picked up other pieces, figure 158. While I was at work, a peasant came to me and inquired whether I would like to see a picture which he had just unearthed. I went with him to a trench close at hand where he had been digging for bricks and found a beautiful piece of plasterwork adhering to a wall, figure 156. It was doomed to instant destruction that the bricks behind it might be removed. I inquired whether such decorations were frequently discovered and promised a reward for any piece that was brought to me, with the result that before I left I had been provided with 4 other examples. 3 showed variants of a continuous pattern, figure 159 and figure 160, while the third was worked with a fret motive, figure 161. To the east of the triple hall there are some underground chambers hollowed out of the rock. They have been explained in various manners and fully described by Violet. Here, as elsewhere in Samara, the rock begins immediately below the surface of the ground. It is a conglomerate of pebbles and a bed of lime, exceedingly hard to work and covered with so thin a layer of earth that no cultivation is possible. The cornfields and vineyards of the Abbasid Samara lay on the opposite bank of the Tigris, in the low alluvial soil beneath the ridge on which stand Huwelisat, the Ashik, and the Slabaya. Near the underground chambers of the Bet el Khalif there are considerable mounds and in some places fragments of building which appertained to the palace. The walls are of sun-dried brick and the rooms have been covered with domes and semi-domes resting on squinch arches. Almost due east of the Bet el Khalifa there rises out of the middle of the plain a large artificial mound, Tel Alij. It is surrounded by a moat, and beyond the moat there are traces of a circular wall. A little to the east of north, a raised causeway leads down from the top of the tell, crosses the moat by what must have once been a bridge, and runs straight as an arrow over the space. Between moat and wall, Ross made it 110 paces, and across the plain for about half a mile. It ends at a low mound where Ross found remains of brickwork. On either side of the point where the causeway reaches the outer ridge of the ditch, a low mound, fanning out from the causeway, stretches from ditch to rampart. These mounds are the remains of walls that protected the causeway. Local tradition says that the moat was fed with water by a canal from the Tigris. Ross adds that the Qanat, or cut as he calls it, brought water from a channel, he uses the word tunnel, by which he probably means Qanat, underground conduit, which ran from the Jebel Harin to Samarra. What this singular fortified mound can be I do not know, but I should be surprised if it did not belong to a period earlier than the days of the Abbasids. All the area of the city is strewn with Mohammedan potsherds, but the pottery is markedly different in character from that of the Raqqa. Colored ware, though it is not entirely absent, is rare. By far the greater number of pieces are unglazed and ornamented only with incised patterns, which are frequently divided into zones by raised, notched bands. I saw, too, a few fragments of a better class of pottery with beautiful patterns or inscriptions in relief, worked with the utmost care. When the peasants discovered that the patterned clay excited my interest, they brought basket-loads of broken pots to my tents, and I drew and photographed innumerable examples, two of which I here reproduce, Figure 162 and Figure 163. In the Mosque of Abu Dulaf, Figure 164, the arcades are carried on massive brick piers, and the effect of the long, half-ruined aisles is very imposing, Figure 165. The area embraced by the outer wall of sun-dried brick is slightly smaller than at Samarra, 213.20 by 136.5 meters, and the arcades are more widely spaced, but the type of plan is the same, even to the spiral minaret to the north. Although the enclosing wall is no better than a crumbling mound, it is possible to make out the gateways, inasmuch as the jambs, which were built of burnt brick, stand more or less intact. The arcades and their returns against the wall are also of burnt brick, and so are the remains of the three bastions, which are all that can be seen in the south wall. In the center of this wall there is another fragment of burnt brick, which might be the curve of a mihrab, but is more probably a door leading into a small building or vestibule, of which the shapeless mounds can be distinguished immediately to the south of the wall. There is a space of 10.4 meters between the outer wall and the southernmost row of piers, and the ruins give no indication of its having been roofed over. But if this transept were open to the sky, it is unlikely that the mihrab should have been placed in it, and I should therefore place a door in the center of the south wall, as at Samarra. The space between the arcades at the northern and southern ends of the mosque averaged 6.2 meters, but the alley which conducts to the central door at either end measures 7.33 meters in width. Similarly, the alley conducting to the central doors leading into the court from east and west is 4.9 meters wide, whereas the average width of the intercolumnation of the east and west arcades is 4.15 meters. The plan exhibits everywhere noticeable irregularities. The arcades vary in width, sometimes by as much as 10 centimeters. The small piers in the harem average 2.1 by 1.73 meters, the greater length being from north to south. The piers of the arcades to east and west of the San average 4.03 by 1.57 meters, the small piers of the northern arcades 2.18 by 1.52 meters. All the piers bordering the central court are adorned upon the face, which is turned towards the court, with a brick niche covered with a cusped arch and placed high up on the pier, Figure 166. There is also a decoration of small niches upon the north side of the base of the minaret. The other sides are too much ruined to have retained the trace of it. The north wall of the mosque is the best preserved, and shows in places the same drainage runnels that were described at Samarra. The ruins of which I have here given a brief account are of the first importance for the elucidation of the early history of the arts of Islam. They can all be dated within a period of 40 years, falling in the middle of the 9th century, and are therefore among the earliest existing examples of Mohammedan architecture. They bear witness to the Mesopotamian influences under which it arose. The spiral towers of Samarra and Abu Dulaf are an adaptation of the temple pyramids of Assyria and Babylonia, which had a spiral path leading to the summit. The technique of arch and vault was invented by the ancient East and transmitted through Sasanian builders to the Arab invaders. The decoration is Persian or Mesopotamian and almost untouched by the genius of the West. In the palaces and mosques of Samarra we can see the conquerors themselves conquered by a culture which had been developing during thousands of years on Mesopotamian soil, a culture which had received indeed new elements into its composition, which had learned from the Greek and from the Persian, but had maintained, in spite of all modifications, its distinctive character. Side by side with Samarra stand the ruins at Raqqa, where the mosque repaired by the Nur el-Din probably preserves a plan which can be dated even earlier than the two mosques on the Tigris. And finally, the scheme and decoration of the Mesopotamian mosque is reproduced with certain variations in the latter half of the 9th century by Ibn Tulun, and the last descendant of the Babylonian ziggurat is the minaret of his mosque at Cairo. End of section 13.
Section 14 of Amurath to Amurath. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Amurath to Amurath by Gertrude Bell. MÔSUL to ZÂKHÅ. April 28, May 10. The city of Mosul has a turbulent record which has lost nothing of its quality during the past few years. It lies upon the frontier of the Arab and the Kurdish populations, and the meeting between those two is seldom accompanied by cordiality or goodwill on either side. Upon the unhappy province of Mosul, hatred and the lust of slaughter weigh like inherited evils, transmitted, who can say, through all the varying generations of conquerors, since the first savage might of the Assyrian Empire set its stamp upon the land. The town is distracted by the ambitions of powerful Arab families, who ruled until less than a century ago, each over his estate in undisputed sovereignty. These lordlings have witnessed, with an antagonism which they are scarcely at the pains to hide, the hand of the Turk tightening slowly over the district. Nowhere will the Arab national movement, if it reaches the blossoming point, find a more congenial soil, and nowhere will it be watered by fuller streams of lawless vanity. Cruel and bloody as Ottoman rule has shown itself upon these remote frontiers, it is better than the untrammeled mastery of Arab beg or Kurdish aga, and if the half-exterminated Christian sects, the persecuted Yazidis, the wretched fellahin of every creed, who sow in terror crops which they may never reap, are to win protection and prosperity, it is to the Turk that they must look. He, and he only, can control the warring races of his empire, and when he has learnt to use his power impartially and with rectitude, peace will follow. But it is yet far from Mosul, and seldom has it seemed further than in the beginning of the year 1909. Except inasmuch as a greater distance from Constantinople and Salonika meant a thinner trickle of Western ideas, I do not believe that there existed in Mosul a more definite opposition to the new order than in other places, though there, as elsewhere in Asiatic Turkey, the forces of reaction were numerous and strong. But Mosul has always been against the government, whatever form it should happen to assume. The begs have always played with the authorities as you play with a fish on the hook, and the fact that they were now constitutional authorities gave an even better zest to the sport and barbed the hook yet more sharply. The affairs of the committee had been ill managed. The local committee, which had formed on the proclamation of the Constitution, had received with open arms the delegates who were sent from Salonika to instruct it in its duties. Indeed, the whole town had gone out to meet them, with the Vali and other notables at its head. But the delegates had been unfortunately chosen. Both were ignorant and tactless. One was a native of Kirkuk, the bitter rival of Mosul, and he had, besides anything but an unclouded personal reputation. The local committee lost rather than gained by their coming, and when they left, they rode unescorted across the bridge, and no one took notice of their departure. With them vanished the slender hopes of improvement which the proclamation of liberty, fraternity, and equality had excited, and the begs were left with a clear field. To their ears the words had sounded like a knell. Universal liberty is not a gift prized by tyrants, and equality stinks in the nostrils of men who are accustomed to see their Christian fellow citizens cower into the nearest doorway when they ride through the streets. They had no difficulty in causing their dissatisfaction to be felt. The organization of discord is carried to a high pitch of perfection in Mosul. The town is full of bravos who live by outrage, and live well. Whenever the unruly magnates wish to create a disturbance, they pass a word and a gratuity to these ruffians. The riot takes place, and who is to be blamed for it? The begs were all in their villages and could have had no hand in the matter. It was Abul Qasim, the noted bandit. It was Ibn this or Ibn that. As for the opportunity, it is never far to seek, and upon this occasion it occurred on the last day of the feast of Bairam, January 1st, 1909. The people were out in the streets, dressed in their best, as is proper to a festival, when a man of the Kurdish mule corps from Kirkuk insulted, so it is said, a Moslem woman of Mosul. In an instant arms were out, the Arab soldiery attacked the Kirkuki sawars, a fight ensued that lasted many hours, and in the confusion several Mohammedan women, holiday-makers, who had not had time to seek refuge in their houses, were killed and wounded, a most unusual disaster. Meantime, the Vali sat trembling in the serai and lifted not a finger to restore order. Late at night, the Kirkukis retired to their own barracks, surrendered at discretion to the government, and gave up their arms. This episode might be dismissed as a natural ebullition of racial animosities, but the events of the following day can scarcely be explained except on the assumption that they were instigated by the begs. In the morning a rabble assembled before the Sarai and cried out for vengeance on the Kirkuki Sowars who were awaiting judgment at the hands of the government. The Vali hesitated, and the ringleaders called upon the crowd to arm. The people executed this order with the alacrity of the forewarned. Shops and private houses barred their doors, and the town was thrown into a state of civil war. There lived at that time in Mosul a certain Kurdish holy man, a native of Suleymaniye on the Persian frontier. Some years earlier, Sheikh Said had fallen foul of the Turkish authorities, his own influence having swelled into too great a force, and had received a summons which was regarded as implying the blackest misfortune, to present himself in Constantinople. It happened, when he arrived in the capital, that a favorite son of the Sultan was lying sick, and since the Sheikh had a great reputation for sanctity, his punishment was delayed while he put up an intercession on behalf of the child. It was effectual, the boy recovered, and the Sheikh returned in honor to his native place, with a chaplet of priceless pearls about his neck and a celebrity immensely enhanced. He was old and had long been harmless, but his sons traded upon his position and presently made Suleymaniye too hot to hold them. The whole family was under the direct protection of Abdul Hamid. It was considered advisable to remove them to a spot where they would be equally directly under the eye of his deputy, the Vali, and they were brought to Mosul. They came in like princes on a triumphal progress. The streets were choked with the mules that carried their possessions, and a house opposite the Sarai was assigned to them as lodging. No sooner had the rioters reassembled with arms on January 2nd than they were directed to the house of the Kurdish family. Sheikh Said was a man of 85, but he had the courage of his race. When he heard the mob storming at his doors, he took the Koran in his hand and, clothed in years and sanctity, stepped out into the street, intending to take refuge in the Sarai. Its door was opposite his own, and the Vali from a window watched the scene. The rabble gave way before the venerable figure clasping the holy book, but before he could reach the Sarai, it closed in upon him. He was cut down and hacked to pieces. His house was then sacked, and 17 of his descendants were murdered. If the leaders of the reactionary party had wished to embarrass the government and to show up its weakness, they were more than commonly successful. During the 6 weeks that elapsed before the arrival of troops from DIYARBEKR and elsewhere, Mosul was in a state of complete anarchy. Christians were openly insulted in the streets, the civil and military authorities were helpless, and no less helpless was the local Committee of Union and Progress. When the troops came, some degree of order was restored, but the reactionary movement was not arrested. The formation of the League of Muhammad, which was designed as a counterblast to the Committee of Union and Progress, went on apace. It appealed to Moslems of the old school, who had a genuine dread of the effects of the new spirit upon the observance of the laws of Islam. It appealed to the ignorant, to whom the conception of the equality of Christian and Muslim is incomprehensible, and it was eagerly welcomed by all who were opposed to constitutional government on grounds more or less personal to themselves. One great magnate went through the bazaars collecting the signatures of adherents to the Muhammadiyah, and for a time the situation was exceedingly critical. It was, however, significant that the Naqib of Mosul, the leading doctor of Islam, steadily refused to sign the papers or to have anything to do with the League. Meanwhile, a new and capable Vali had been appointed to the province, but he had gone straight to Kirkuk, where matters were in a still more parlous state, and lawlessness walked abroad unchecked in the streets of Mosul. At length the Vali realized the dangers that threatened the province through its capital, and being a man of action, he traveled post-haste to Mosul and set about the restoration of order. He arrested and imprisoned a number of persons, and administered severe rebukes to the leading Moslems, together with assurances that the government would protect the rights of the Christians. These warnings were repeated in strong language the day after the accession of Muhammad Rashad, when the first rumors of a massacre of Armenians at Adana reached the bazaars. The fall of Abdul Hamid set an immediate term to the agitation. In all likelihood, the counter-revolution of April 13 had caused no surprise to the organizers of the League of Muhammad, but the swift action of the Salonika Committee had not been foreseen. The story ran that after the flight of the deputies from Constantinople, the Vali had received a telegram bidding him obey no orders from the capital of the empire. I cannot vouch for the truth of the tale, but it is not in itself improbable. The Vali was backed by an unwontedly large body of troops, those who had been sent in to quell the disturbances which had arisen out of the murder of Sheikh Said, and all over Turkey the troops stood loyal to the Constitution. The city waited with a growing apprehension as day by day telegrams arrived reporting the advance of the Salonika army on Constantinople, nor was it unknown that a message from Baghdad, offering instant help to the constitutional party, had passed through Mosul. Then on a sudden came word that Abdul Hamid had been deposed, and except to the country folk, and to me upon the high road, it had been half expected. So it was that when I came to Mosul, I found the town, which is one of the worst conducted in the Ottoman Empire, submissive and quiet. In the week during which I remained there, we had no further intelligence, save the vague rumor of an outbreak at Adana. Even the assurance that Mohammed V was Sultan in his brother's place we accepted from Turkish official sources, neither had we any means of ascertaining whether he had been recognized by the powers of Europe. Turkish official sources are apt to be tainted, and few regions can be further removed than eastern Turkey from the pure fountain of the truth. Nevertheless, the British embassy in Constantinople did not see fit to acquaint its vice-consuls in Asiatic Turkey with the accession of a new sovereign. I leave this observation without comment. But if we in Mosul were uncertain as to the turn events had taken in Europe, we had valuable opportunities of gauging local conditions. In Mosul, not a voice was raised against the second triumph of the new order. With the entire lack of initiative which characterizes the Asiatic provinces, men resigned themselves to a decree of fate which was substantially backed by the army. Whether this second victory was to prove more decisive and more permanent than the first was open to question. The doubt kept people to their houses and affected the attitude of some of the most powerful of the begs, who, being lords of great possessions which they desired to enjoy in peace, would have given a whole-hearted support to the new sultan, but held back lest his government should not prove strong enough to defend them against their ill-conditioned brethren. In vain the valley filled the prisons to overflowing with noted malefactors. If he brought them to trial, he knew that no one would dare to advance evidence against them, and in the meantime the jails were growing more dangerously crowded every day. There was undoubtedly some personal feeling for Abdul Hamid, but it was rare. I made the acquaintance of a citizen of Mosul, a splendid type of the old school, for whom it was impossible not to feel sympathy, even though I know him to have been one of the instigators of the murder of Sheikh Said. This man watched from a room in the Serai the proclamation of Mohammed V, and when he saw the soldiery tear down and trample underfoot edicts which were signed with Abdul Hamid's name, he, being alone but for one other, who was my informant, threw himself upon the ground and wept. "The dogs!" he cried. "Yesterday they would have been proud if their name had been mentioned in the same breath with his." To me he was more guarded. Moreover, he had had time to recover his balance. But he predicted wreck and ruin, bloodshed, revolution, and all other evils for his country. "Is there no remedy?" said I. "If the source is pure, the whole stream is pure," he answered enigmatically. "Was the source pure?" I asked. He hesitated a moment, and then replied, "No, by God and the Prophet. A king should go about among his subjects, see them and hear them. He should not sit imprisoned in his house, listening to the talk of spies." I know another, poles asunder from the first, one of the richest men in the town and one of the most evil. A slave by birth, he might not sit in the presence of his former master, although the master, great gentleman as he was, could scarcely outmatch the wealth of the liberated slave. Him I asked whether there was any strength behind the Arab movement. "The Khalifa should be of the tribe of the Quraysh," he answered significantly. "Who would be the Khalifa if he were chosen from out of the Quraysh?" I asked. "The Sharif of Mecca is of that blood," he answered. "The Arabs would govern themselves." He left me to reflect upon his words, for I was well aware that if he chose to support them with force, all the rogues with whom the city abounds were at his command, and all the plots and counterplots of the vilayet were familiar to him. I sat long in the guest chamber of a third acquaintance, the head of the greatest family in Mosul. So stainless is his lineage that his sisters must remain unwed, since Mosul cannot provide a husband equal to them in birth. His forebears were Christians, who migrated from DIYARBEKR 200 years ago. The legend runs that his Christian ancestor, soon after he had come to Mosul, went out in the morning to be shaved, but when he reached the barber shop, it was filled with low-born Moslems, and the barber kept him waiting until the heads of the faithful had been trimmed. "Shall a man of my house wait for such as these?" he cried, and forthwith abjured the creed of slaves. His descendant was one of those who would gladly have seen the new order triumph and give peace to the land. He called down vengeance upon the head of Ahmed Izzet Pasha, one of the worst of the late Sultan's sycophants, and upon that of his brother Mustafa, sometime Vali of Mosul. "If he had stayed 2 years more, he would have ruined the town," said he. But his hatred of Izzet Pasha had not blinded him to the dictates of honor. It happened that by those methods of persuasion of which Izzet was master, he had induced my friend to present him with a valuable piece of land. 2 months later, Izzet fell and fled in terror of death from Constantinople, but the beg would not revoke a gift which the disgraced favorite was powerless to exact from him. Noblesse oblige. I had also the advantage of conversing with several bishops. Now, there are so many bishops in these parts that it is impossible to retain more than a composite impression of them. They correspond in number to the Christian sects, which are as the sands of the seashore, but as I was about to journey through districts inhabited by their congregations, I made an attempt to grasp at least the names by which their creeds are distinguished from one another. As for more fundamental distinctions, they depend upon the wording of a metaphysical proposition, which I will not offer to define, lest I should fall, like most of my predecessors, into grievous heresy. The most interesting, historically, of these several denominations are the people of Mar Shimun, some of whom I had met upon the road. They are currently known as Nestorians, though, as Layard has observed, this title is misapplied. The followers of Mar Shimun are the representatives of the ancient Chaldean church, and their race is probably as near to the pure Assyrian stock as can be expected in regions so often conquered, devastated, and repeopled. Their church existed before the birth of Nestorius, and was not dependent upon him for its tenets. Its doctrines are those of primitive Christianity untouched by the influence of Rome, and its creed, with unimportant verbal differences, is that of Nicaea. After the Council of Ephesus in 431, the members of the Chaldean Church separated themselves from those who acknowledged the authority of the Pope. Politically, they were already a separate community, for they lived not under the Byzantine, but under the Sasanian Empire. Their missionaries carried Christianity all over Asia, from Mesopotamia to the Pacific. Their patriarch, whose title was, and still is, Catholicos of the Eastern Church, was seated first at Ctesiphon. When Baghdad became the capital of the Caliphate, the patriarch was removed thither, and upon the fall of the Arab caliphs it was transferred to Mosul. During the 16th century a schism took place which led to the existence of 2 patriarchs, one living at the monastery of Rabban Hormuzd near Al-Kosh, and one at Kochanis in the mountains south of Van. The first, with his adherents, submitted 2 centuries ago to the Pope. They are known as the Chaldeans, and they are said to bear the yoke of Rome very unwillingly. The second is now the only patriarch of the old independent church, which has been dubbed Nestorian. The office may be termed hereditary. It passes from uncle to nephew in a single family, for the patriarch is not permitted to marry. The holder of it is always known as Mar Shimun, the Lord Simeon. It is generally believed that if the new government were to succeed in establishing order, so that the protection of a foreign power should cease to be of vital importance, the Chaldean converts would return in a body to their former allegiance to the Catholicos of the East. A similar division exists among the Jacobites, the Syrian Monophysites, who were condemned in 451 by the Fourth Ecumenical Council, held at Chalcedon. A part of this community has submitted to Rome and is known as the Syrian Church, while those who have retained their independence have retained also their old title of Jacobites. To this pious confusion, Protestant missionaries, English and American, have contributed their share. There are Syrian Protestants and Nestorian Protestants, if the terms be admissible, though whether the varying shades of belief held by the instructors are reflected in the instructed, I do not know, and I refrain from an inquiry which might have resulted in the revelation of Presbyterian Nestorians, Church of England Jacobites, or even Methodist Chaldeans. None but the theologian would essay a valuation of the relative orthodoxy of converted and unconverted, but the archaeologist must hold no uncertain opinion as to their merits. The unification, so far as it has gone, of the two ancient churches with Rome is an unmitigated misfortune. The Chaldeans and the Syrians, instigated perhaps by their pastors, have been so eager to obliterate the memory of their former heterodoxy that they have effaced with an unsparing hand all, or nearly all, Syriac inscriptions older than the date of their regeneration, and in Mosul it is rare to find any written stone earlier than the end of the 17th century. This is the more provoking, as several of the churches are of great architectural interest, and it is much to be regretted that the epigraphic record of their history should not have been preserved. So far as I could judge, the oldest parts of the oldest churches may probably be dated in the 12th or 13th centuries. All have been considerably remodeled. Some were entirely rebuilt after the siege of Mosul by Nadir Shah in 1743, and others have been rebuilt in recent years. Moreover, there are several which would seem to have been first founded as late as the 18th century. But whatever may be their date, they all exhibit the same simple plan, a plan which I believe to be essentially Mesopotamian and more ancient by many centuries than the existing churches. It is that of the barn church, the church with two aisles and a nave, covered by parallel barrel vaults, so equal in height as not to admit of a clerestory. The nave and aisles are invariably cut off from the sanctuary by a wall. It is too substantial to be called an iconostasis, broken by three large doors. This complete separation is not typical of primitive ecclesiastical architecture. It results as a rule from a development of the ritual, but it appears to be here a part of the original plan. The sanctuary is almost invariably divided into three parts, corresponding to the nave and aisles, and as a rule the central altar is covered by a dome set upon squinch arches. The church of Mar Ahudani will serve as a typical example. Figure 168. It is now in the hands of the Chaldeans. A flight of steps leads down to it from the street, and the fact that it lies so far below the modern level is one of the indications of its antiquity. The stair opens into a small atrium, with a cloister to east and west. The church is to the south of the atrium, and there is no means of approach to it from any other side. The present atrium is comparatively modern, and the church shows many signs of reconstruction and repair. The doorway from the nave to the sanctuary is richly decorated with Arabic inscriptions, with mouldings and entrelacs, Mohammedan in character, and I should say not far removed from the early 13th century in date. There are also motives which are repeated with variations upon all the churches of a like epoch, grotesque lions and the cross-legged figure which has been described upon one of the gates of Baghdad. The building was so dark that my photographs were not successful, but an outer doorway of Mar Girgis gives an adequate idea of the scheme of decoration, figure 169. The straight arch, which serves here as lintel, is a universal characteristic. So too are the ornaments pendant from the voussoirs. The doorways in the cloister that lie to the west of Mar Tuma, the Episcopal Church of the Syrians, exhibit beautiful variants of the same theme, figure 170. In this church, the door leading from the nave to the sanctuary is framed by an entrelac enclosing in its windings the figures of Christ and the 12 apostles. 3 extra aisles have recently been added to the original building, and I understand the church to be shared between the Syrians and the Chaldeans. If the Christian architects continued to make use of a primitive Oriental plan, it is even more certain that they continued to be dependent upon Eastern artists for their decorative schemes, and were in no way linked with the West. Their decoration is the same as that which is to be found in contemporary Mohammedan buildings. For instance, a lintel which now lies in the atrium of Mar Shimun, a church which has been almost entirely rebuilt, is carved with an entrelac unmistakably Mohammedan, figure 172. Over one of the doors of Mar Tuma there is a band of ornament, which may perhaps have been taken from a Mohammedan building, though it is more probable that it formed a part of the original Christian work, figure 171. The style of this deeply undercut relief is so marked that it imprints itself upon the memory. I saw other examples of it in the beautiful tomb of the Imam Yahya, which, according to an inscription, was built by the Sultan Lulu. Figure 174. A mosque for the Friday prayers existed in the time of Ibn Battuta, close to the Tigris, and this is in all probability the building which is praised by Mustafi, who says that the stone sculptured ornament is so intricate that it might stand for wood carving. This particular kind of stone relief, which is to be found both in Muslim and in Christian buildings, does in fact closely resemble wood carving, and the Christian examples cannot be of a different date from the Muslim. The first recorded mosque in Mosul was built by Marwan II, the last of the Umayyad caliphs, 744 to 750, not far from the Tigris, according to Ibn Hawqal. So far as I know, no trace of it has survived. Nur ed-Din, the Atabeg, 1146 to 1172, built a second Friday mosque in the bazaar, and this must be the great mosque with the leaning minaret, which stands in the center of the town, but how much of the original work remains I could not determine, for Mohammedan feeling was running high when I was in Mosul, and at such times it is wiser not to ask for admittance into mosques. Finally, a third Friday mosque was erected near the Tigris, represented, as I conjecture, by the tomb of the Imam Yahya, and to Lulu's day belongs also to the Ziarah of Abdullah ibn Hassan in the heart of the town. The interlock round the door of this Ziarah is very similar to the decoration of the sanctuary door in Martuma, except that the figures are absent. In the interior there is a band of deeply cut stone relief of the woodwork type. The fluted, cone-like roof with which the Ziarah is covered is found in all the Muslim tombs of Mosul. There's another fragment of Lulu's handiwork, which, ruined though it be, is of great architectural importance. The Qala Lulu on the Tigris bank, not far from the tomb of the Imam Yahya. Only the eastern end of two vaulted halls is standing, but in one of these remains of stucco ornament still cling to the walls. Figure 173. The ornament consists of a band of inscription and a band of tiny arcades, each arch containing the representation of a nude human figure, depicted from head to waist. Below this band there has been another design of larger arches, covered with rinceaux, which are adorned with flowers and birds. The town walls are comparatively modern, but the Sinjar gate, on the west side, is worthy of note. It resembles the gates of Aleppo, and like them it bears a blazonry of lions. One other memory of the days at Mosul stands very freshly in my mind. There exists in the town a small and indigent Jewish community, neither too small nor too poverty-stricken to have attracted the watchful care of the Alliance Juive. Under their auspices, M. Maurice Sidi, a courageous and highly cultivated Tunisian, has opened a school for the children, and by precept and example he imparts the elements of civilization, letters, and cleanliness to young and old. The English vice-consul, who had witnessed his efforts with great sympathy and admiration, invited him to bring a deputation of his co-religionists to the consulate while I was there, and a dignified body of bearded and white-robed elders filed one morning into the courtyard. We returned their visit at the school, where we were received by a smiling crowd dressed in their best, who pressed bunches of flowers upon us. The classrooms were filled with children proudly conscious that their achievements in the French, Arabic, and Hebrew tongues had called down honor upon their race. The scholars in the Hebrew class, who were of very tender years, were engaged in learning lists of Hebrew words with their Arabic equivalents, Hebrew being an almost forgotten language among the Jews of Mosul. Monsieur Sidi drew forward a tiny urchin, who stood unembarrassed before us, and gazed at him expectantly with solemn black eyes. "What do you know?" said the master. The black-eyed morsel answered without a shadow of hesitation, "I know Elohim." And while I was wondering how much of the eternal secret had been revealed to that small brain, he began to recite the first list in the lesson book, which opened with the name of God, Elohim, Allah. I do not remember how it went on, neither did he remember, without Monsieur Sidi's prompting. Elohim was what he knew. Over against Mosul lies Nineveh. The pontoon bridge that spans the Tigris had been swept away by the floods. The masonry arches on the further side stood out into the river, but where the causeway dips down to meet the bridge of boats, it met nothing but the swiftly flowing stream. We crossed, therefore, by a ferry, and so rode up to the mound of Kuyunik, where Xenophon saw the ruins of Nineveh and thought them to be a city of the Medes. His description of the immense area they covered scarcely seemed incredible as we stood upon the mound. The line of the walls ran out far to the north, far to the south, embracing the neighboring mound of Nebi Yunus, which is the site of one of Jonah's many tombs. The corn grew deep on Kuyunjik, and the blue bee-eaters flew in and out of layered excavation pits. Across the fertile plain rose the towers of Mosul. The broad Tigris ran between, which Saladin sought to turn from its bed when he laid siege to Nur ed-Din. His imperious folly is as forgotten as the splendors of Sennacherib. And such plenty and perfection, of grass never was, such a carpet as this summer-time o'erspreads and embeds every vestige of the city. Had the poet been dreaming of Nineveh when he wrote Love Among the Ruins? Shut them in with their triumphs and their glories and the rest. We rode from Nineveh through blazing heat for 4 hours across a plain where the peasants were harvesting the barley, while the locusts harvested the green wheat, which was not ripe enough to save. The sun beat so fiercely upon us that I sought refuge in the house of the village sheikh at Amarkan, and ate in his guest chamber a lunch which was made more palatable by the sour curds which he set before us. An hour and a half further we came to Mar Benam, and found the tents pitched upon the slopes of a mound above a deep round pool. On the one side of our camp lay the monastery of Mar Benam, on the other the shrine that covers his grave. The monastery has the appearance of a small fort. Its outer walls have been many times ruined and repaired, and the interior buildings, all except the beautiful church, are modern. The doorways leading from the porch into the church, and from the nave and aisles into the sanctuaries, are covered with lacework patterns, interspersed with small figures of angels, lions, and snakes, together with Arabic and Syriac inscriptions. In the porch, between the 2 doors, there is a small niche worked with arabesques, the very counterpart of a Moslem mihrab. There are square chambers leading out of the aisles, roofed with pointed domes which are elaborately worked with stucco ornaments. On the east wall and on one of the piers of the nave are 2 stucco plaques, one representing St. George on horseback, the other a full-length figure of a saint. On both there are traces of color. I paid my respects to the saint's tomb in company with a number of pilgrims from Mosul who were spending the night in the monastery. At dusk the villagers assembled under the mound, which marks the spot as some small suburb of Nineveh, and watered their flocks at the pool. I watched them from my tent door, and thought that the scene must have changed but little in the past 3,000 years. We rode next day in 2.5 hours to Karakosh, where there are no less than 7 churches. 3 of them stand outside the village, each surrounded by its fortress wall, which usually encloses 1 or 2 small living rooms besides the church. They reminded me forcibly of the walled Coptic monasteries of Egypt, but the monastic buildings were smaller. Between them stretched fields of barley, wherein the villagers, standing in line, were pulling up the crops to the strains of the bagpipes. The churches were oriented almost at haphazard, and provided with the smallest doors and windows to correspond. The interiors were so dark that I abandoned all hope of photographing the ornaments upon the inner doors, though I made a rapid sketch of the lintel over the sanctuary door of Mar Shimun, figure 175. Above it was a slab bearing a floral Persian pattern incised upon the stone. Inside the town, several of the churches had recently been repaired or were in the process of reparation. A young priest, Kas Yusuf, showed me the work and gloried in the replacing of old and ruined churches by new and brand-new edifices. New lamps for old, but it was the old lamp that could summon the genius, and I realized the sound moral of the fairy story as I watched the refurbishing of ancient walls at Karakosh, but I did not impart my impression to the Syrian priest, whose ardor it would have been unkind to damp. The Syrians have annexed most of the larger churches, so said the worthy Jacobite father who brought me the key of Mar Shimun, and he told his tale not without a touch of bitterness. Yet it would have been folly to blink the fact that he was no match for Kas Yusuf, who was young and eager and had been trained in a French school at Mosul. 20 minutes beyond Karakosh we came to the ruined church of Mar Yuhanna Dele Moya, St. John the Delemy, which no one has troubled to repair, though it had beautiful carved lintels and domes adorned with plasterwork. Thence we rode for an hour through cornlands to Bartalla, and saw Bashika at the foot of the hills. They were real hills which lay before us, not the bare desert ridges which were all the heights we had seen since we crossed over Lebanon on the way to Aleppo. Here were the buttresses of mightier ranges than Lebanon, the Alps of Kurdistan which end the land of the two rivers. As we climbed upwards, the corn grew greener, the grass deeper, the flowers more brilliant along the edge of trickling streams. But my companions paid no heed to these marvels. Yusuf's thoughts were busy with the great cities he had seen since he set forth on his travels, and especially with Mosul, last and therefore fairest in his memory. He rehearsed its advantages to the Mosul Zaptieh, and Abdullah was well pleased to listen to such talk. "Not even in Aleppo," said Yusuf magnanimously, "do you find better bread." "However many places there may be in the world," pronounced Abdullah, "there is none where the bread is so good." "It's sweet," assented Yusuf. "And if you take tobacco from Mosul to Baghdad," Abdullah pursued, "it rots there. The air of Baghdad is not like the air of Mosul." "Wallah, no," said Yusuf, the much-travelled, weighing city against city in the finest judicial manner. We rode through exquisite meadows, and in about 5 hours and a half from Karakosh crossed a mountain stream that rippled between banks rosy with oleander. Solomon in all his glory was not arrayed in robes so softly flushed. Beyond it my camp was pitched upon a swelling slope, below the steep rocks of Jebel Maklub, wherein, placed high among the hills, stood the monastery of Mar Matai, a grey wall hanging over a precipice. I left my horse at the camp, and taking Abdullah with me, set out on a half-hour's climb up a narrow gorge, full of the western sun, which was golden now and clement. Every crevice between the stones was gay with a small starry campanula, gentian blue, mountain blue, the full clear color of an upland flower, and thrusting their strong roots under the rocks, the terebinths hung glossy foliage over the path. I found myself, as I looked once more upon the divine curves of leafy twig and bough, heaping contempt upon the recollection of that leggy vegetable, the palm. A ragged boy opened the monastery gate, and conducted us by a long stair to a terrace from which the bishop had watched our progress up the gorge. He bade me go quickly, while the sun still shone, to see the church and the tombs of Mar Matai and of Bar Hebraeus. But the church had been rebuilt, the inscriptions on the tombs were already known, and my desire turned towards the bishop, and the coffee which he was preparing for us, and the room on the terrace where the cushioned windows opened onto the Assyrian plain. The bishop was old and very garrulous. The monastery, high set above the world, was beyond the reach of mundane intelligence. The only monk had gone down to Mosul, and in the Jebel Maklub men were still uncertain under which lord they served. Was it indeed true, asked the bishop, that Mohammed Rashad was Sultan of Turkey? And he rejoiced greatly when we confirmed the rumor. But his thoughts wandered back to older histories, and, hearing that we had come from Mar Benam, he began to instruct us in matters pertaining to that shrine. "My daughter, listen," said he, and I lay back upon the cushions, and watched the light redden and fade over the plains of Assyria, while the sweet mountain silence fell more closely in the gorge, and the bishop's rambling tale filled the idle hour like some voice out of the past. Abdullah sat cross-legged upon a pile of carpets at the end of the room, rolling cigarettes and nodding his head in approval, as the venerable weaver of romance unfolded his chronicle. "Sennacherib, king of Assyria, king of kings," he began. "To him a son was born whose name was Benam. And it happened upon a day that the Amir Benam was hunting, and he lost his gazelle, and night came upon him while he pursued her. And being weary with the chase, he fell asleep beside a fountain. Then in his sleep an angel appeared unto him, and bade him hearken to one whom he should meet next day upon the road. And when he had journeyed but a little way, he met Mar Matai. And Mar Matai stopped him and said, O prince, why do you worship idols that have eyes that see not, ears that hear not, lips that speak not, instead of worshipping the living God, who made heaven and earth, al-ins wal jins wal jami, mankind and different kinds and all kinds? And Benam answered, Give me a sign. Then said Mar Matai, What sign shall I give you? And he said, Heal my sister, who is sick. And they went on their way towards Nineveh, and as they went, Benam was full of fear, for he dared not take the saint into his father's city. But when they reached Bartala, Mar Matai was weary and could walk no further, and he said, If I make water to gush out of the rock, will you believe?" And Behnam answered, "I will believe," and the water gushed forth. Then Behnam returned to Nineveh, and he refused to worship idols that have eyes that cannot see, and ears that cannot hear, and lips that cannot speak. "It is true," said Abdullah. "Neither would he worship the sun," pursued the bishop, "nor the moon, nor the stars, nor anything but the living God, who created heaven and earth, mankind and different kinds, and all kinds." "It is written in the book," said Abdullah. "My son," said the bishop, "it is written." And Christian and Muslim met on the common ground of Scripture. Then Sennacherib put him and his sister to death. But the king was old and sick unto death, and he repented of what he had done, for he had no heir to inherit the kingdom. Therefore he sent for Marmatai, and entreated him to bring his son to life. And Marmatai answered, "O king, I will raise him from the dead, if you will build me a monastery in the Jebel Maklub." And Sennacherib built the house wherein we sit, concluded the bishop. "And who built Mar Behnam?" said I, anxious to prolong the recital. "My daughter," he replied, "the house of Mar Behnam was built by Ishak the merchant. For Ishak was journeying to Baghdad, and upon the road he fell ill, and Mar Behnam appeared to him and healed him. Verily, the Assyrians were idolaters, but they came to know the true God. So the world changes." The bishop broke off abruptly at this confusing point in the narrative, for even he felt that it would be an anachronism to assert that the Assyrian Empire was Christian. But the historical sequence of events was nothing to Abdullah. "God is great," he assented. "The world changes." And he rolled another cigarette. We ran down the path in the dusk and found my dinner table spread under the moon. Round the campfire sat Alins Waljins Waljami, and watched the boiling of Haj Amar's rice pot. The end of section 14. Section 15 of Amurath to Amurath. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Amurath to Amurath by Gertrude Bell. MôSUL to ZÂKHÅ continued. However many countries there may be in the world, there are none so rich in faiths as the mountain frontiers of eastern Turkey. Beliefs which have been driven out with obloquy by a newfound truth, the half-apprehended mysticism of the East, echoes of Western metaphysics and philosophy, elusive memories of paganism, all have been swept together into these hills, where creeds that were outlined in the childhood of the world are formulated still in terms as old as themselves. Islam, with the lash of its simple, clear-cut doctrine, has herded them into remote places. Cowering there under centuries of persecution, they have hidden their sacred things from the eyes of the spoiler. In silence they endure the reproach which dogs the most innocent practices of a secret cult, and each sect awaits, through ages of misery, the reward and the Redeemer which its peculiar revelation has promised. These outcast communities make a potent appeal to the imagination and to the sympathy. I have no desire to pry into that which they choose to conceal, neither have they any wish to take me into their special confidence, but their hospitality is unfailing, and whenever I find myself among them, I find myself among friends. We were now entering the country which is the headquarters of the Yazidis, who, from their desire to conciliate or to propitiate the spirit of evil, are known to Moslem and Christian as devil-worshippers. By Moslem and by Christian they have been placed beyond the bounds of human kindness, and while the Mohammedan has been unremitting in his efforts to bring them, by methods familiar to dominant creeds, to a sense of their shortcomings, the Christian has regarded the wholesale butchery which has overtaken them from time to time as a punishment justified by their tenets. I had journeyed before among Yazidi villages in the mountains of North Syria, and had been struck by the clean and well-ordered look of the houses, and by the open-handed friendliness of the people, as well as by their courage and industry. The Mesopotamian Yazidis I knew only through the descriptions contained in Layard's enchanting books, but I carried a letter to Ali Beg, the head of the sect, and promised to visit him in his village of Badri, and to see, if he would permit, the most sacred of all Yazidi shrines, Sheikh Adi. Abdullah, when he learnt of my intention, expressed his entire approval of Ali Beg as a man, but he would hear nothing of his religious convictions, because they were not founded upon a book. "Effendim," he said, "Muslims and Jews and Christians have a book. It is only the infidels which have none, and the Yazidis are infidels. They worship the Shaitan." "You must not speak of him while we are at Badri," said I, "for the Yazidis never take the name of the devil upon their lips, and to mention him in their presence is a shameful insult." "God forbid," replied Abdullah. We rode over flowery foothills that were bright with hollyhock and gladiolus, borage and mullein, and in an hour and a half from our camping ground we reached the village of Jazaran. "These are Shabak," observed Abdullah. "What are Shabak?" I asked. "They are not true Moslems," he replied. "God knows what they believe. They resemble the Shias. Effendim, they came with the armies of the Ajam, and after the Ajam departed, they remained. The Ajam are the Persians, or, roughly speaking, any barbarians." We went down into a lovely valley where the storks waded wing-deep through grass and buttercups. Kemresh is its Kurdish name. Wadi Aswad in Arabic, and both mean the Black Valley. Everywhere I was now given a Kurdish as well as an Arabic name for the villages, and the mother tongue of the inhabitants was Kurdish, though as a rule they spoke Arabic also. 3 hours from the camp we crossed a stream in the Wadi Ain Sifna, and half an hour beyond it we rode through the first Yazidi village, Mukbil. The Yazidis, being of Kurdish race, do not differ in appearance from the rest of the population, except in one particular of their attire. They abhor the color blue, and eschew it in their dress, but red they regard as a beneficent hue, and their women are mostly clothed in dark red cotton garments. The valley in which Mukbil lies is of uncommon fertility. Rice is cultivated here, and cotton. The emerald green of the grass indicated the presence of swampy ground, and the heavy air was full of the perfume of growing things. I lunched under a fig tree near a Yazidi hamlet. The village elders brought me curds and bread unasked, and refused to take payment. Having climbed a green ridge, we dropped into the valley of Bavian, crossed a deep river, and rode up its bank till we came, 4 hours from Mukbil, to the famous rocks which are carved with Assyrian reliefs and inscriptions. Under them we pitched our tents, and a more exquisite camping ground you might go far to seek. Fatou knew the place. He'd been here with one of whom he spoke as Mr. Keen. This legendary personage appears frequently in Fatou's reminiscences, and I suspect him to be no other than Mr. King, of the British Museum. "He gazed long upon the men and animals," observed Fatou with indulgent recollection, "and many times he photographed them, and then, voila, he climbed up the rocks, and all the writing he took down in his book. Not many of the gentry are like Mr. Keen, and your Excellency need not trouble to copy the writing once more." I troubled not at all, but looked in amazement at the great figures of gods mounted on lions, and kings standing in adoration, which Shalmaneser II had carved upon the cliff, figure 176. Behind some of the groups, rock-cut chambers have been hollowed out in a later age, their doorways breaking through the figures of the reliefs, and the stream eddies round the feet of winged beasts and bearded men, walking in procession, cut upon huge boulders which have been dislodged from the face of the hill. When I had seen these wonders, I wandered up the valley to a point where the cliff bends round and holds the river in the curve of its arm. Here lay a deep, still pool, the banks of which were starred with daisies and poppies, and the rocks with campanulas and orchids. The water, dyed to a ruddy brown by recent rains, was like a disk of polished bronze, in a setting of green and white and scarlet enamel. I sat for a little and listened to the birds singing about their nests in the cliffs, and the river breaking over the stones below the pool, and then I swam in the warm brown water and went upon my way rejoicing. A fortunate chance sent other travelers to visit the reliefs that day, Dominican fathers from the monastery of Mar Yaqub, 2 days' journey to the west of Bavian. They gave me much valuable information before they rode away on their mules, and I only hope that they enjoyed my tea half as much as I enjoyed their conversation. They were bound for Sheikh Adi, and hearing that I was also on my way thither, they told me of the underground chambers of the shrine, now seldom shown to strangers, and of the spring that runs through them from basin to basin, of the Yazidi adoration of fountains, and of the baptismal rites which they practice, ceremonies which they borrowed from another Mesopotamian sect, the Mandeans, who are called the Christians of St. John. So sacred is the element of water that a Yazidi will not enter a Moslem bath, nor will he eat of fish, which is born of water. They spoke, too, of the religions of dualism, of which the Yazidi faith is one, though it is probably derived through Manichaeanism from an ancient Babylonian source rather than directly from Zoroaster, since it preserves the reverence for the sun which sprang from Mani's identification of light with the principle of good, and out of their wide experience of local customs they drew parallels from the Christian sects, whose observances reflect those of primitive cults, and told me of Christians who, like the Yazidis, turned to the sun to pray. Then they left me with the birds and the river and the Assyrian gods to reflect upon the unchanging persistence of human beliefs. It is a 5 hours' ride from Bamiyan to Badri, and during the course of it I began to learn something of the terrible lawlessness which turns the beautiful Kurdish mountains into a hell upon earth. We passed upon our way a small Kurdish settlement, of which the houses burrowed into the hillside like the lairs of wild animals. It is the winter quarters of one Hassan Jangir, a robber chief of the Kochars, the nomad Kurds. 2 days before it had been raided by the government, in retribution for innumerable outrages, and such of the population as yet lived had fled into the hills. The feudal lord of Hassan Jangir is Sheikh Haji, who was at that time, to the satisfaction of the whole countryside, imprisoned in Mosul, but his liegeman had joined forces with another redoubted malefactor, Sheikh Nuri, and it was rumored that the pair with their followers had been encamped the previous night on the heights above Bamiyan. It was not without reason, as I now perceived, that the Vali of Mosul had insisted on providing me with 4 zaptiehs instead of the customary 2. The village of Badri clings to the green slopes of the foothills, and Ali Beg's whitewashed house stands over it like a miniature fortress. The Beg, who is the descendant of the other Ali to whom Layard stood godfather, with some misgivings as to what might be the duties of the sponsor of a devil-worshipping baby, received me in his divan with the utmost cordiality. He is a man of middle age, with a commanding figure and a long beard, light brown in color, that curls almost to his waist. He was dressed from head to foot in white, and as we sat together in the divan, I thought that I had seldom drunk coffee in more remarkable company. I told him that I knew his people in the Jebel Simun, and that they had spoken of him as the ruler of all. "The ruler of us all," he replied gravely, "is God." In the courtyard were a pair of peacocks, in honor, no doubt, of the angel peacock who rules the age of 10,000 years in which we live, and is the symbol of him who must not be named. His bronze effigy is carried by the Kawals, the higher priesthood of the Yazidis, when they journey among the scattered communities of the sect, and to whatever dangers they may be exposed, it is said that the image has never been allowed to fall into the hands of infidels. The Yazidi women are neither secluded nor veiled, and when Ali Beg took me to see his wife, we found her in the midst of her household, male and female, giving orders for my entertainment. She was a handsome woman, dressed in a robe of purple cotton, with a black velvet cap placed over the muslin veil which was wrapped about her head and under her chin, but did not conceal her face. On her wrists she wore heavy gold bracelets set with turquoises. She talked nothing but Kurdish, so that my greetings and my gratitude were conveyed to her through the Beg's secretary, a Chaldean from Al-Kosh. Few Yazidis can either read or write, such knowledge being forbidden to them, and I doubt whether the Beg himself had any acquaintance with letters. In the women's quarters I knitted an instant friendship with Ali Beg's small son, Said Beg, and though we had no common language in which to express our feelings, our intimacy advanced silently by leaps and bounds, while he sat upon the largest of my camp chairs and watched me eat the sumptuous meal with which his father had provided me. When I had finished, there was enough and to spare of rice and mutton, bread and semolina pudding, and sour curds to satisfy all my servants and soldiers. Meantime the Beg had made preparations for my visit to Sheikh Adi, whither 2 Yazidi horsemen and all my 4 zaptiehs were ordered to accompany me, lest we should meet with Kurdish robbers in the hills. Ali Beg, with a dignified retinue of elders, one of whom was a Kawal who had that day returned from the Jebel Sinjar, watched our departure. Figure 177. Their fine, grave heads and flowing beards gave them a singular resemblance to the kings and gods upon the rocks of Bavian, and perhaps the likeness was not merely fanciful, for the higher dignitaries of the Yazidis intermarry with none save those of their own rank, and who knows what ancient blood may flow from generation to generation through their veins. We rode into the folds of the hills by a path so stony that we were forced at times to dismount and lead our horses. Bushes of flowering hawthorn grew among the rocks, oak trees, in newly opened leaf, were scattered over the steep slopes, and the grass was full of poppies and the last of the scarlet ranunculus. The Yazidis hold the ranunculus in high esteem, its bright red color being of good omen in their eyes, and I regard it with no less favor, though perhaps for more superficial reasons. After a climb of close upon 2 hours, we reached the summit of the hill, and the path dipped down through sturdier oak woods into a secluded valley, out of the heart of which rose the fluted spires of Cbteddy, a sanctuary and a tiny village embosomed in plains and mulberries and ancient fig trees. Figure 179. We sat down by the edge of a clear fountain, while one of my Yazidi guides went forward to announce our arrival to the Khatun, the sister of Ali Beg. She came to meet me in the outer court of the shrine, a tall and slender woman, wrapped in white robes, with a black cap upon her head, and a heavy linen veil thrown over it and drawn tightly under her chin. She took me by the hand, and bidding me welcome in the few words of Arabic which she had at her command, led me past the booths where the hucksters spread out their wares during the days of the great yearly festival. They stood empty now under the mulberry branches. We passed through a doorway into a small paved court, still and peaceful and half-shaded by mulberries. The further side was bounded by the wall of the shrine, which opens into the court by a single door. Upon the wall near the door a snake is carved in relief upon the stones and painted black. Figure 178. With a singular magnetic attraction it catches and holds the eye, and the little court owes to its presence much of the indefinable sense of mystery which hangs over it as surely as hang the spreading branches of the mulberry trees. I took off my shoes and followed the Khatun as she stepped softly over the grass-grown pavement. At the door she paused, touched with her lips the stone, and murmured a Kurdish prayer in which I heard the frequent repetition of Cbteddy's name. In her white robes and heavy veil she looked like some strange priestess. The Sibyl of the Delphic shrine might have stood so, robed in white, and kissed the marble gateway of the sun-god's house. A cool darkness and the murmur of water greeted us as we entered. We found ourselves in a large oblong chamber, lying, as near as I can guess, from east to west, and divided into 2 vaulted aisles, of about the same width, by a row of 7 piers. From under the wall on our left hand flowed a streamlet of clear water that ran into a square tank, and out of it down the length of the southern aisle. In the north aisle there was a tomb covered over with colored cloths. "Holy man's grave," whispered the Khatun as we passed it. But we had not yet reached the sanctuary which holds Cbteddy's bones. The eastern end of the north wall is broken by a door which leads into a dark chamber containing a second tomb. This chamber is covered by the smaller of the 2 spires. To the west of it is a second square room bigger than the first, and here Cbteddy's tomb stands under the larger spire. It was totally dark. The wick, floating in a saucer of oil, carried by the Khatun, did little to illuminate it, and I lighted a coil of magnesium wire, to the delight of my guide, who interrupted her prayers to Cbteddy to utter ejaculations of pleasure each time that the white flash leapt up into the dome. For my part, I would as soon study by the flame of a will-o'-the-wisp as by the uncertain brilliance of magnesium wire, coupled as it is with the assurance that the burning tendril will ultimately expend itself upon my skirt, and I got no more profit from the display than the gratification of the Khatun and the knowledge that the high cone was set over the angles of the chamber on squinch arches, a construction which I could have predicted while it was still wrapped in darkness. Beyond the tomb chamber, and parallel with the north aisle, lies a long vaulted room, pitch dark like the other, and filled with oil jars. For Cbteddy, said the Khatun, and kissed the well-oiled door as we entered. Still further west we came to a vaulted gallery, running along the north side of the court. It, too, was dark, except where the light shone through a few cracks in the wall. We went back through the 2 domed rooms, and when we reached the smaller tomb chamber, the Khatun turned to me, saying, "Come." Up to this point we had been accompanied by the Zaptiehs and by the Yazidis from Ba'adri. To these she pointed the way into the aisled hall, and taking my hand she led me to a low door in the eastern wall of the tomb chamber. She bent her slender figure and passed through it, holding up her lamp to light my path. I followed her down 6 steps into a small chamber, dimly illumined by faint rays that struggled through chinks in the masonry of the south wall. The north wall was, so far as I could see, cut out of the solid rock. From under it gushed a spring which is said to take its source in the well Zemzem at Mecca. As in the upper building, the water flowed into a small square basin, and through a hole in the wall at the eastern end of the room, but it flowed at its own pleasure. Or perhaps the well Zemzem had been overfilled by the rains, and the stream was greater than is usual, for it covered the floor to the depth of several centimeters. I stood doubtfully upon the lowest step, and then decided that the wisest course would be to pull off my stockings. Bare feet take no harm from a watery floor, though feet accustomed to be shod will tread unsteadily upon the sharp pebbles with which the spring has plentifully bestrewn the pavement. The Khatun was much distressed to see me reduced to this plight. "Bichare," she said, "poor one." We splashed across the chamber and into a low passage, which turned at right angles and conducted us into a second room. The stream came with us, and was caught in yet another basin. In the dim twilight my companion turned quickly towards me and laid her hand upon my arm. "Are you not afraid?" she whispered. I looked up into the white and gentle face, wrapped round with the whiter veil, on which the burning wick cast a ghostly light, and because of my deep ignorance I was much perplexed. "No," I answered. "I am afraid," said she, and then I understood that if I had known how holy was the ground whereon we trod, not even the sharp pebbles would have prevailed over my mind against its awe-inspiring shades. The stream gushed out under the east wall. The Khatun opened a small door beside its mouth, and we passed out, blinking, into a sunny courtyard, half filled with piles of firewood, which I believe to be the wood used in the annual sacrifice of the white bull to Sheikh Shems, who is the sun. We returned round the south of the building, past the house which is occupied by the Khatun and by Ali Beg when he comes to the festival, and rejoined the Zaptiehs in the inner court. There we sat long under the trees, eating freshly baked bread and drinking bowls of milk with which the Khatun provided us. It was with difficulty that I persuaded her not to kill a lamb and add it to the meal, which she considered far too modest for our merits or for her reputation as a hostess. Little is known of the saint whose tomb is the central shrine of the Yazidi faith. He is variously reported to have sprung either from the regions near Aleppo or from the Hauran, and he died in the year AD 1162. He was one of a number of illuminators, of whom the Sufi mystic Mansur el-Haddaj was another, he who suffered martyrdom for asserting the permeation of all created things by the deity with the phrase, "I am God." The angel Jesus is a third, not the phantom Jesus whose death is recorded in the New Testament, but the spirit whose place that other had usurped, and many of the Jewish prophets are revered in the same manner. There is a tradition that the building which is now Sheikh Adi's tomb was once a Christian church, but though I looked sharply for evidences that might confirm this report, I could not be sure that they existed. It is certain that there were earlier edifices upon the present site, and the building has been so often destroyed and restored that its original form must have been almost obliterated. Round the doorway there are reused stones covered with the net-like patterns which are to be found in the churches at Karakosh. An Arabic inscription, built into the same wall, bears the date 1115, but this date undoubtedly refers to the Mohammedan era, and the inscription is therefore barely 2 centuries old. Below it, a second representation of a serpent is carved upon the wall, not painted like the one near the doorway, and lying parallel with the ground instead of standing upright. What the black snake signifies I do not know, neither did I ask for an explanation, which would not have been accorded. Layard says that the Yazidis repeatedly assured him that it was without significance, and I should have been given no other answer. Abdullah, who knew as little as I, volunteered the information that a Yazidi will never kill a black snake, but when I asked whether there were many such reptiles in the hills, he replied that, so far as he knew, there were none, and his testimony as to the practices of the Yazidis, when confronted with them, did not seem to me to be of much value. Before I left Bahadri, I received an invitation to be present at the summer festival. Of the ceremonies performed at this time, Layard has left 2 wonderful descriptions, and if I ever find myself at Mosul in the height of the summer, I shall not forget Ali Beg's proffer of hospitality. It was near sunset when we reached Bahadri. After night had fallen, Said Beg came to fetch me to his mother's quarters. We held converse through the Christian secretary, and our talk was mostly of the child who sat beside me smoking one cigarette after another. "In my country children may not smoke," said I. "Oh, Said Beg, little children like you should be asleep at this hour." The Khatun smiled at him tenderly. "We can deny him nothing," said she. And the secretary added, "The arak they give him is worse for him than the cigarettes." Sobriety is not, I fear, to be numbered among the Yazidi virtues. I left next morning at an early hour, and the secretary saw to the comfort of my departure, and received my thanks for the kindness which had been shown to us, but neither he nor any other of Ali Beg's people would accept a reward. As I was about to mount, he said that the Beg would ask a favor of me. "Upon my head and eyes," said I. "Will you leave with us some of your fire ribbon? He would light the tomb with it at the next festival." I broke off half the roll, and by this time the fame of magnesium wire must have spread to the Jebel Sinjar, or even to the Jebel Simun, and in the skirts of many a pious person a hole has doubtless been burnt. Having breakfasted with the devil worshippers, I lunched with the prior of Rabban Hormuzd. The monastery, which is a very ancient and famous Nestorian house, once the seat of a patriarch, now belongs to the Chaldeans, that is, to the Catholic Nestorians. It lies high up in the hills above Al-Kosh, a village 4 hours to the west of Bahadri. When we reached Al-Kosh, I sent my caravan forward, and with Yusuf and Abdullah climbed for half an hour up a narrow rocky valley by a winding path which led us to a postern in the wall. In the flourishing Nestorian days, innumerable hordes of monks lodged in caves among the rocks. Many of these caves are still extant, though many have crumbled away with the crumbling of the stone, but few are tenanted. Rich, who has left an interesting account of Rabban Hormuzd, was of opinion that the amphitheater of cliffs honeycombed with caves was an ancient Persian burial place converted into a Christian monastery. Traditions differ as to the history of the tutelary saint. Some say that he was martyred in the persecution of Yazdegerd, king of Persia, and some in that of the Emperor Diocletian. The date of the foundation of the monastery is generally given as falling within the 4th century, though the prior, Kazbek, told me that it was founded in the 7th century. Exceedingly little of the original monastery remains, and Rich relates that at the time of his visit it had recently undergone a comprehensive restoration. The present buildings, and no doubt the ancient buildings were much the same, climb in tier above tier up the precipitous hillside. The house of Kazbek stands highest of all, and there I sat in the window seat and gossiped with the jolly prior. We brought him news of the accession of Muhammad V, on the hearing of which he bubbled over with satisfaction, and declared that Salonika was the savior of the empire, and that all his allegiance was given to the young Turks, and all his hopes depended upon them. Even in the last 6 months order had been foreshadowed in the Kurdish hills, and with Muhammad V upon the throne and Sheikh Haji in prison, who could predict how far it might not be carried? It was encouraging to listen to views so optimistic, even though I knew that the prophecies of Kazbek must be slow of fulfillment. I began to forget the weariness caused by the heavy steaming heat of the plain, and half an hour in the prior's lofty house, together with a lunch of omelettes and honey and sour curds, completed the cure. Thus restored, I followed him into the church. The main part of it, according to him, is about 400 years old, but a chapel, which is obviously later in date, was, said he, erected about 100 years ago. For English eyes it has an interest out of all proportion to its age, for upon the doorway are carved the names of James and Mary Rich, with the date 1820, and of Henry Layard, with the date 1846. An age of splendid achievement in travel was that which saw Rich and Layard, Chesney and Ainsworth and Rawlinson. For much of our knowledge of the remoter parts of Asia we depend still upon the bountiful information with which their learning and their courage supplied us. To the south of the church, a passage is hollowed out of the cliff. It leads into a tiny rock-cut chamber, to the ceiling of which 2 iron rings are fastened. From these, observed the prior, Rabban Hormuz suspended himself when he fell into meditation, and here it is the custom for pilgrims to make their offerings. The hint, I need hardly say, was effectual. The baptistery lies southwest of the church. It is built of masonry and covered by a dome on squinches. To it and to the vaulted chamber adjoining it I should give an earlier date than to the rest of the edifice. Much cheered in mind and body, and laden with roses from the monastery garden, we rode down into the insufferable heat of the low ground. Shortly after leaving Alkosh, our path turned into the hills to the right, climbed by a charming valley with a rushing stream in its depth, crossed a low pass, and led us out into the broad green plain which lies between the Jebel Alkosh and the Jebel Dehuk. Flowering grasses brushed our stirrups as we rode, but, in spite of its fertility, the plain is almost uncultivated. The few villages, Moslem and Christian, are harried by the robber bands of Sheikh Nuri, and whenever the miserable peasants have gathered together such modest wealth as their resources permit, the nomad Kurds fall upon them with rifle and with firebrand. Thus it is that long tracts of land are unpeopled, and the hamlets that exist are more than half in ruin. One we passed that had been looted and left a smoldering heap of ashes 2 years earlier, but the newly aroused hopes of firmer government had induced the peasants to return to it, and the houses were springing up again. The deep grass through which we journeyed, both on this day and on the next, is looked upon as a sore peril, since it tempts the Kurds down into the lowland pastures. To avoid this annual reign of terror, the peasants are wont to set it on fire as soon as it ripens, leaving but a small patch round each village. For a week the plain is wrapped in flame and smoke, and the stifling heat of the burning rises up to the hilltop monastery of Mar Yaqub, where the Catholic priests are witnesses to the appalling destruction of what might have been a rich harvest, and to the bitter oppression which turns the bounty of nature into a recurring threat. Yusuf, whose imagination is not to be roused except by considerations of a soundly practical character, cast his eye over the fields and observed thoughtfully, "The muleteers of Baghdad must starve this year to buy fodder for their cattle, yet here is enough to feed all the Jezere. Heaven send peace to this fair country." We camped near the small village of Grepan, in Arabic, Tel Arid, the broad mound, where we found our tents pitched. It had taken us 3½ hours to reach it from Alkosh, but the caravan time had been somewhat longer. Upon the following day we had a hard march. The caravan was 10 hours upon the way, and I, with Abdullah and Yusuf, considerably more, for we began the day with an excursion from the road to the Assyrian reliefs above Maltai. We turned to the right, up the valley that leads to Dehuk, and leaving our horses at the foot of the hill under the care of Yusuf, Abdullah and I climbed up and sought for the sculptures. It was rough going, and we had been insufficiently directed, so that for long we sought in vain. At last, in despair, I sent Abdullah back to fetch a guide, and sat down to wait for him under a rock. Clumps of flowering saxifrage covered the stones, Campanula pyramidalis lifted its tall spires out of the crevices. The wide green valley lay below, its sparsely scattered villages, each clustering about an ancient mound, and beyond it rose the mountain chains of Kurdistan. The air was full of the fragrance and the freshness of the hills, and alive with the sound of their waters. To all the high places of the world I have given allegiance. All exercise a like authority and confer like privileges, and in these distant solitudes I claimed and was accorded an old established right of mountain citizenship. Abdullah's mission came abruptly to a successful termination. We had climbed high above the reliefs, and his keen eye espied them as he made his way down. They are 4 in number, and on each precisely the same scene is depicted. A king stands in adoration before a procession of 7 gods, 6 of whom are mounted upon the backs of beasts, while one is seated upon a throne borne by a lion. Another, or perhaps the same king, follows the company of gods on foot. A tomb or cell has been broken through one of the reliefs, as at Bavian. In subject and in style the reliefs in both places are closely alike, and though there are no inscriptions at Maltai, the learned have concluded that the work there must be of the same epoch as that at Bavian, and have dated it in the reign of Shalmaneser II, 860 to 825 B.C. They have yet to solve the difficult problems connected with the interchange of religions and artistic conceptions between the Assyrians and the Hittites, whose sculptures show at a far earlier date the same strange motif of a divinity standing upon the back of a wild animal. For the rest of the day we journeyed along the foot of the hills by the Mosul High Road. In the middle of the afternoon Abdullah observed conversationally, "That's the house of a bandit," and he nodded his head towards a small white fort under the hills. The bandit was, at that period, imprisoned at Mosul, but his empty dwelling served Abdullah as a peg whereon to hang a denunciation of the Kurds, root and branch. "As God is almighty," said he, "they fear not God nor the Sultan. They take the load and the camel with it. Allah al-Wakil. They fire at the soldiers of the government. They seize the load and the mule." "Where do they buy arms?" I asked. "From Ibn Sabah of Kuwait," he replied. "They travel down the Tigris to the Gulf in Kelex, and there they buy a rifle for 3 Ottoman pounds and sell it here for 10 pounds, with a rich merchandise, voila. They return from the Gulf of Persia. And how can we prevail against them when Abdul Hamid showed them favor? Sheikh Haji was a shepherd in the hills, a shepherd with a shepherd's staff guarding the sheep, till Abdul Hamid made him a beg. Praise God, he is now in the Mosul prison. May God curse him." "God strengthen the new government," said I. "Please God," he answered. After 5 hours' quick riding from Maltai, the post road turned to the right over the hills. We did not follow it, but rode straight on for another 40 minutes to our camp at the Kurdish village of Kole. I had heard of a fortress which lay upon the western slopes of the Jebel al-Abiad, half an hour beyond Kole, and thither I went next morning. It proved to be the ruins of a fortified town, of which nothing but the outer wall was standing. The spurs of the Kurdish mountains are covered with fortress ruins, outlying strongholds of the highland races against the inhabitants of the plains, or else defenses serving to protect the fruitful lowlands from the inroads of the tribes. They date, so far as I can judge, from every period, from the Assyrian to the Ottoman, but the majority are undoubtedly Kurdish, robber fastnesses of the marauding chiefs who have spread terror over the countryside for many a century. In this last category I should not, however, place Za'afiran. The wall is built of fine masonry. It is about 1.70 meters thick, the outer and the inner faces being of dressed stones, the core of rubble and mortar. It runs up to the top of a rocky bluff which has been divided from the area of the town by a cross wall. The rock forms a natural citadel, but I could see no signs of masonry other than the wall upon its summit. Indeed, the ground falls so sharply that there is little room for building. From this elevated position the town wall can be seen stretching out in an irregular, elongated semicircle, and the plain slopes down from it towards the Tigris, which lies 2 or 3 miles to the south. In the center of the town there is a large mass of ruin, near which are some rock-hewn sarcophagi. 2 clearly marked streets cross the enclosed area at right angles to one another, the one passing by the central ruin and running down to a gate in the south wall, the other running from east to west and probably from gate to gate. The eastern gate is visible, but the western part of the wall is so much ruined that the position of its gateway is not to be determined. The lintel and door jambs of the south gate are standing. The width of the opening is only 2 meters, and the lintel here and in the east gate, where it has fallen to the ground, is unadorned and uninscribed. The character of the masonry and the existence, as is proved by the lines of street and ruin heap, of a town carefully planned upon an ordered system, point to a date prior to the Mohammedan conquest, and I am inclined to seek for a Byzantine origin for Za'afiran. Perhaps it may be a relic of the triumphant, though brief, reoccupation by Heraclius of the provinces ceded to the Persians by Jovian. I followed my caravan back to the Mosul highway, and so across the hills to ZÂKHÔ. We climbed up the pass by as good a road as any in Turkey, but while we were rejoicing over its excellence, it broke off short, and left us to find our way down the opposite side of the pass as best we might along a bridle path strewn with boulders. So we came down into the valley of the Khabur, and saw before us the snowy wall of the Kurdish Alps, figure 180. At the gate of the pass stands ZÂKHÅ, old and isolated, as Ainsworth says, and it would be difficult to better the phrase. The more ancient part of the village is built upon an island in the Khabur. The right arm of the river is spanned by a masonry bridge. The left arm washes round the castle, a fortress which must have had a long and checkered history, though I can find no record of it. The masonry is of many different periods. The finest and probably the oldest part is an octagonal tower which juts out into the stream on the southeast side. The outer walls are all fairly well preserved and make an imposing appearance, but the interior is terribly ruinous. In the upper part of the building there is a large hall with windows opening onto the river. The engaged columns, which support the interior pointed arches of these windows, are covered with a delicate tracery of carving, very like Seljuk work of the 13th and 14th centuries. This part of the castle cannot be dated later than the 14th century, but the foundations and the octagonal tower must be considerably older. Last of all, the Turkish garrison has supplemented the ancient work with wretched structures of rubble and mortar, and these too have fallen into ruin and have been given over to the storks, who nest contentedly among them. In ZÂKHÔ lies buried the first missionary to Kurdistan, the Dominican Soldini, who died here in 1779. The quarter that stands upon the right bank of the Khabur is mainly Christian, and contains, I believe, 2 small churches of no very great age, but my curiosity was quenched before I reached them by a violent thunderstorm which drove me back to my tents. It swept down the valley from Ahmadiyeh, and rolling away left the mountains so magically beautiful that I could give no further thought to any architecture but that of their white pinnacles and spires. The end of section 15. Section 16 of Amurath to Amurath. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Amurath to Amurath by Gertrude Bell. ZÂKHÔ to DIYÂRBEKR. May 10 to June 4. The Babylonians, and after them the Nestorians and the Moslems, held that the Ark of Noah, when the waters subsided, grounded not upon the mountain of Ararat, but on Judidach. To that school of thought I also belong, for I've made the pilgrimage and seen what I've seen. The snows that gleamed upon us from under the skirts of the thunderstorm when we camped at ZÂKHÅ were the springtime wreaths of Jebel Judi, and resisting all other claims we turned our faces towards them on the following day. Selim the muleteer gloried in this decision. He was a native of the hills above Kilis, and like all mountain people, his spirits rose with the rising ground. Above ZÂKHÅ, the Khabur is spanned by a masonry bridge of 4 arches. But when we came to Dernak, we found the Hazil Su innocent of bridge or ferry boat. The river, which is the principal affluent of the Khabur, ran deep and swift by reason of the melting snows. In midstream its waters touched the top of my riding boots and buffeted my mare, so that I thought that she would certainly fall. Indeed, she would have fallen, but for 2 of the inhabitants of Dernak, who, with garments rolled round their waists, held bravely up her chin. Another pair was attached to each of the baggage animals. The muleteers joined in the sport, and we reached the further side without loss. 4 hours and a half from ZÂKHÖ, we passed by Tel Kobin, an ancient mound with a village of the same name a little further to the north, and in 2 hours more we entered the foothills and lunched in an oak grove near the village of Gerik. Our path led us over rising meadows to Gurmuk and Dadar, and so into the mouth of a gorge where Hasanah nestles under rocky peaks. The clouds gathered over the mountains, and thunder came booming through the gorge as we pitched our tents by the edge of the stream, 9 hours from ZÂKHÖ. Hasanah is a Christian village inhabited partly by Nestorians and partly by the converts of American missionaries. The pastor of the Protestant Nestorians, if I may so call him, when I asked him what was his persuasion, he replied that he was Perot, came at once to offer his respects, coupled with a bunch of pink roses from his garden, and I, being much attracted by his sturdy figure and simple open countenance, asked him to guide me next day through the hills. Over and above his personal charms, Kasmatai had the advantage of a knowledge of Arabic. He spoke besides Kurdish and Syriac, but his native tongue was Falahi, the peasant language, which is no other than Assyrian. His brother Shimun, who accompanied us on all our expeditions, he climbed the rocks like a cat or a Grindelwalder, had nothing but Falahi and Kurdish and a cheerful face, but with one or the other, or all 3, he made his way deep into my affections before we parted. We walked up the narrow valley, where flowers and flowering shrubs nodded over the path in an almost incredible luxuriance, and climbed a steep wooded hillside to a point where the rock had been smoothed to receive the image of an Assyrian king, though none had been carved upon it. Above it rose a precipitous crag, clothed on one side with hanging woods, through which zigzagged a very ancient path, lost at times among fallen rocks and trees, while at times its embankment of stones was still clearly to be traced. On the summit of the crag were vestiges of a small fortress. The walls were indicated by heaps of unsquared stones, many of which had fallen down the hill where they lay thickly strewn. The evidence afforded by them, and by the carefully constructed path, made it certain that we were standing on the site of some watchtower that had guarded the Hasanak gorge. On the opposite side rises a second crag, whereon, said Kasmatai, are ruins of the same description. That the valley was held by the Assyrians there can be no doubt, for it is signed with their name. Below and to the west of the crag, to which we had climbed, there is another smooth niche in the rock, and here the work has been completed, and the niche is carved with the figure of an Assyrian king, wearing a long fringed robe and carrying a scepter. At a later age the mountains had been occupied by Christians. Kasmatai showed me at the foot of the crag a few vaulted chambers, which he declared to be the ruins of a Nestorian monastery, and walking westward for an hour or more along the wooded ridges, we came to a second and larger monastic ruin, with a garden of fruit trees about it, and groves of tall blue irises which had escaped from the cemetery of the monks and wandered over the hillside. In the high oak woods I forgot for a few hours the stifling heat which had weighed upon us ever since we had left Mosul. Each morning we had promised one another a cooler air as we neared the mountains. Each evening the thermometer placed in the shade of my tent registered from 88 degrees to 93 degrees Fahrenheit. The heavy air was like an enveloping garment which it was impossible to cast off, and as I walked through the woods I was overmastered by a desire for the snow patches that lay upon the peaks, for one day of sharp mountain air and of freedom from the lowland plague of flies. Sefinit Nebi Nuh, the ship of the prophet Noah, was there to serve as an excuse. Accordingly, we set out from camp at 4 o'clock on the following morning. Kasmatai and Shimun in their felt sandals, rashiki, a proper footgear for the mountaineer, Selim, whom Providence had marked out for the expedition, Abdul Mejid, a Zaptieh from ZÂKHÔ who had been ordained as pointedly to walk upon flat ground, and the donkey. As for that donkey, said Fatou, if he stays 2 days in the camp eating grass, Selim will not be able to remain upon his back. He was Selim's mount, and Selim, who knew his mind better than any other among us, was persuaded that he would enjoy the trip. The donkey therefore carried the lunch. We climbed for 2 hours and a half, through oak woods and along the upper slopes of the hills under a precipitous crest. But this was not what I had come out to see, and as soon as I perceived a couloir in the rocks I made straight for it, and in a few moments stepped out upon an alp. There lay the snow wreaths. Globularia nudicalis carpeted the ground with blue, yellow ranunculus gilded the damp hollows, and pale blue squills pushed up their heads between the stones and shivered in the keen wind. Selim had followed me up the couloir. "The hills are good," said he, gathering up a handful of snow, "but I do not think that the donkey will come up here, nor yet Abdul Mejid." We returned reluctantly to the path and walked on for another half-hour, till Kasmatai announced that the Ark of Noah was immediately above us. Among asphodel and forget-me-nots we left the Zaptieh and the donkey. Selim shouldered the lunch bags, and we climbed the steep slopes for another half-hour. And so we came to Noah's Ark, which had run aground in a bed of scarlet tulips. There was once a famous Nestorian monastery, the cloister of the Ark, upon the summit of Mount Judi, but it was destroyed by lightning in the year of Christ 766. Upon its ruins, said Kasmatai, the Moslems had erected a shrine, and this too has fallen, but Christian, Moslem, and Jew still visit the mount upon a certain day in the summer, and offer their oblations to the prophet Noah. That which they actually see is a number of roofless chambers upon the extreme summit of the hill. They are roughly built of unsquared stones, piled together without mortar, and from wall to wall are laid tree trunks and boughs, so disposed that they may support a roofing of cloths, which is thrown over them at the time of the annual festival. To the east of these buildings there is an open court enclosed by a low stone wall. The walls, both of the chambers and of the court, are all, as I should judge, constructions of a recent date, and they are certainly Mohammedan, since one of the chambers contains a mihrab niche to the south, and in the enclosing wall of the court there is a similar rough niche. Further to the west lie the ruins of a detached chamber built of very large stones, and perhaps of an earlier date. Beneath the upper rocks upon which these edifices stand, there is a tank, fed by the winter snows which had not entirely disappeared from the mountain top. Still further down upon a small plateau are scattered fragments of a different architecture, carefully built walls, stone doorposts, and lintels showing above the level of the soil. Here, I make little doubt, was the site of the Nestorian monastery. The prospect from the Ziara was as wild, as rugged, and as splendid as the heart could desire, and desolate beyond measure. The ridge of Judi Dach sinks down to the north onto a rolling upland which for many miles offers ideal dwelling places for hardy mountain folk. There were but 4 villages to be seen upon it. The largest of these was Shandokh, the home of a family of Kurdish Agas, whose predatory habits account for the scantiness of the population. To the east of it lay Heshtan, which is in Arabic Thamanin, the 80, so called because the 80 persons who were saved from the deluge founded there the first village of the regenerated world when they descended from Jebel Judi. Further to the north an endless welter of mountains stretched between us and Lake Van. They rose towards the east into snowy ranges, and very far to the southeast we could see the highest snow peaks of Tiari, where the Nestorians, grouped under a tribal system, defend their faith with their lives against the Kurdish tribes, a hereditary warfare marked with prodigies of valor on the part of the Christians, and with such success as the matchlock may attain over the Martini rifle. Because the light air breathed sharply off the snows, and because the vista of mountains was a feast to the eye, we lay for several hours in the sanctuary of the prophet Noah. There can be no manner of doubt that I ought to have completed the pilgrimage by visiting his grave, but it lay far down upon the southern slopes of Judi Dach, and I was making holiday upon the hilltops. Therefore, when we turned homewards, we bade Shimun conduct the donkey and Abdul Mejid to Hasanah, and ourselves kept to the crest of the ridge. Half an hour from the summit, we met some Kurdish shepherds near a small heap of ruins, concerning which they related the following history. Once upon a time there was a holy man who took a vow of pilgrimage to the ship of Noah, and for a month he journeyed over hill and vale until he reached the spot on which we stood. And there he met the evil one, who asked him whence he came and whither he was going. The holy man explained that he was bent on a pilgrimage to the ship of Noah. "You have still," said the devil, "a month's journey before you." Thereat the pilgrim, being old and weary, lost heart, and since he could not return with his vow unfulfilled, he built himself a hut and ended his days within sight of the goal, if his eyes had not been too worn to see. The presence of the shepherds upon Mount Judi was not to be attributed to any pious purpose. They had come up from the villages below to escape from the sheep tax, which was about to be levied for the second time within a 12-month, once for last year's arrears and once for this year's dues. Their lawless flocks skipped among the boulders and the snow wreaths as light-heartedly as the wild goat, which no government can assess, but the owners lived in anxiety. And when, half an hour further, we encountered a second company, they took us for soldiers and greeted us with rifle shots. Kazbek grasped the situation and shouted a justification of our existence, which was not received without hesitation. I was standing, when the shots began, in the middle of a neve, and thinking that I must offer a fine mark, I stepped off the snow and sat down upon a gray rock to await developments. But as soon as we had made it clear that we were simple people with no official position, we were allowed to pass. "It was well," observed Kazbek as we clambered down the crags, "that Abdul Mejid was not with us. They would have killed him." At the foot of the rocks we sat down to rest beside a bubbling spring. "Have you suffered at the hand of the government?" I asked my guide. "We suffer from the Kurds," he replied, "and there is no one to protect us but God. Effendim, the Agawat from Shandokh, come over the pass and claim hospitality from us. We are poor men. In all Hasanah there is not one who is ignorant of hunger. How shall we feed the Agawat, and their mares and the followers they bring with them? And how shall we refuse when they are armed with rifles?" "Have you no arms?" said I. "We have no money to buy rifles," he answered, "and if we bought them, the Kurds would take them from us. And when we have killed our last sheep, that we may entertain them, they seize upon all we possess before they leave us." "Oh, merciful!" ejaculated Selim. "Sir," said Kazbek, "last year they took my bed, and that which was too worthless to carry away they broke and threw upon the fire. But if we resisted, they would burn the village." We ran down through the oak woods and got into camp at 4 in the afternoon. "God prolong your existence," cried Fatou. "Have you seen the ship of the prophet Noah?" "Oh, Fatou," I replied, "prepare the tea. I have seen the ship of the prophet Noah." So it is that I subscribe in this matter to the wisdom of the Koran. And immediately the water abated, and the decree was fulfilled, and the ark rested upon the mountain of Judea. Next morning the camp was sent straight to Jezreel, which it reached after a 6 hours' march, but I, with Shimun as guide, followed the line of the hills. We rode for 2 hours through the oak woods, and then crossed a gorge wherein lies the Moslem village of Evler. The incomparable beauty of these valleys passes belief. Evler was buried in a profusion of pomegranate and walnut, fig and almond and mulberry trees. The vines were wreathed from tree to tree, the ground beneath was deep in corn, and the banks of the stream aglow with oleander. An hour further we reached the Nestorian village of Shach, where a ruined castle protects the entrance of the gorge. The walls climb up the hillside towards a citadel placed upon a high peak. Above the village 2 deep valleys run up into the mountains, and each has been walled across, so that Shach was guarded from attack on every side. I should judge these fortifications to be Kurdish, but there are traces of an older civilization on the rocks above them. Of the 4 Assyrian reliefs that are reported to exist, I saw only 3, the 4th being cut upon the face of the cliff and unapproachable except with ropes. Each of the 3 niches which I was shown, after an hour's climb in the hottest part of the day, contained a single figure. Like that of Hassanach, each had been covered with cuneiform inscriptions, but in 2 cases both the figure and the inscriptions had all but weathered away. We left Shach at midday, stopped for a half an hour to lunch by the stream, and reached Jezreel ibn Umar at 4 o'clock. The camp was pitched upon a high bank overhanging the Tigris, but the bridge of boats which should have connected us with the town was broken, and I crossed by a ferry on the following day. Jezreel ibn Umar is built upon an island formed by the Tigris and a small loop canal. It is called after a certain Hassan ibn Umar of the tribe of Taghlib, who lived in the 9th century. Upon the river's edge stands a much-ruined castle, of which the masonry is mostly of alternate bands of black basalt and white limestone. Over one of the doors are carved a couple of rudely executed lions. The town walls still exist in part, and belong to the same date as the castle. So too does the fragment of a masonry bridge which spanned the Tigris about a half an hour's ride below the town. On our way to it we forded the moat, which was at that time quite shallow. One of the bridge piers is decorated with a key pattern of black and white stone, and with some curious reliefs representing the signs of the zodiac, of which the work is similar in character to that of the lions upon the castle gate. Each relief bears an inscription in Arabic, naming the zodiacal sign which it depicts. As we came back through the town, we stopped at the principal mosque, which has a pair of fine bronze doors with bronze knockers worked in a design of intertwined dragons. A small dome, set upon columns that may have been taken from an earlier building, covers the fountain in the courtyard. Jezreel ibn Umar has a bad reputation for the fever which is bred in its marshy moat. Moreover, it was stifling hot. I hurried through a cursory sightseeing and ferried back to the opposite bank, where I found the baggage animals loaded and ready to start. Having followed the Tigris bank for half an hour, I left the caravan to pursue its way to Finik and turned up the valley of the Risur Chai. In less than 2 hours from Jezreel, we came to a ruined Kurdish fort, standing on either side of the stream and blocking effectually the passage of the gorge. And carved upon the rocks of the left bank, there is a more ancient guardian of the pass, a warrior armed and mounted upon a bounding horse. His companion, who went on foot, has fallen into the stream, and I know no other record of him than Layard's woodcut. The figure of the horseman is much defaced by time. The winter rains have worn thin his armor, the spring floods have undermined the rock on which he stands, but shadowy though his image may be, it marks the triumph of a European civilization, and its prototypes are to be sought not among the bearded divinities and winged monsters of Assyria, but in the work of Western sculptors. The Parthian, who was the bitter enemy of the Roman Empire, carved it upon the rocks of Kazbek, and bore witness with his own hand to the overmastery of Roman culture. We cut across the hills back to the Tigris, and rode by a memorably inadequate path, equally memorable for the profusion of oleanders through which it ran, up the bank to Finnick. The high ground on either side of the valley falls sharply to the water, and the river bursts here through the last barrier of mountain which divides it from the Mesopotamian plain. Finnick has been from all time the key of the ravine. Before we reached the side gorge in which the village lies, we passed a great enclosure of ruined walls and towers, and below it, among the rice fields that occupy a cape jutting into the stream, there are remains of similar fortifications. Beyond the gorge of Finnick we rode under a crag which is crowned by the most commanding of the many castles, and less imposing fortress ruins are clustered about its foot. We made our way through groves of pomegranate down to the camp, pitched in clover pastures by the river. A ferry boat was drawn up upon the bank, and with its help we designed to convey ourselves the next morning to the further side. But the boat was ancient and the stream swift, and I suspected that the passage would be a long business. Therefore I left Fateh to cope with the ferryman, and went up while he did so to the village. A tumbling stream and masses of oleander fill the gorge. The greater part of the inhabitants of Finnick are lodged in caves, preserving no doubt the customs of their remotest ancestors, whose rock-cut dwellings they have inherited. We climbed up to the castle by a winding path, and entered it on the side furthest from the Tigris, the face of the hill turned towards the river being a precipitous rock. The castle wall is partly of masonry and partly of the natural rock, and the gate is tunneled through the cliff and flanked by small rock-cut chambers. Within the enclosure there are a number of underground chambers, and on the highest peak the rooms are rock-hewn and vaulted with masonry. How old the rock-cutting may be I cannot tell. The masonry is not very ancient, some of it may be modern, while none could safely be dated earlier than the Middle Ages. But the position overhanging the Tigris is superb, and it is difficult to think that the Phoenix which Sapor overthrew stood on any other crag. The rolling plateau of the Tur Abdin stretched away to the southwest, and since I observed that the ferrying of my caravan was taking as long a time as I had anticipated, I sat down and made a comfortable survey of the country we were about to traverse. We returned to the village by the way we had come, there is no other, and climbed the rocks on the opposite side of the valley, where Layard found a much-effaced Parthian relief. It depicts the figures of a man and a woman, clad in short tunics which hang in heavy folds over loosely fitting trousers. Above the man's head are traces of an inscription which, even in Layard's day, was indecipherable. Our guide hurried back to the village while I was examining the tablet, and when we came down we found him spreading a meal of omelets and bread and bowls of Iran, a most delectable drink made of sour curds beaten up in water, under the shade of some mulberry trees, a welcome sight to those who have breakfasted early and climbed over many rocks. A less pleasing surprise awaited us when we reached the Tigris. Not half the horses had crossed, and the ferry-boat was engaged in intricate and lengthy maneuvers on the opposite side. There was nothing to be done but to wait for its return, and I lay down among the clover under a hawthorn bush. It was here that we were to bid a final farewell to the Greeks, who had accompanied us from the outset of the journey. When they had arrived at a spot where the Tigris was quite impassable from its depth and width, and where there was no passage along its banks, as the Carduchian mountains hung steep over the stream, it appeared to the generals that they must march over those mountains, for they had heard from the prisoners that if they could cross the Carduchian heights they would be able to ford the sources of the Tigris in Armenia. They turned north, therefore, and fought their way through the land of the Carduchi, which are the Kurds, until they reached the sea, while we, having a ferry-boat at our disposal and a smaller force to handle, passed over the Tigris into the Tur Abdin. So at length we parted, and Cheirosophus in advance with the light-armed troops scaled the hills of Finnick and led slowly forward, leaving Xenophon to bring up the rear with the heavy-armed men. Their shields and corselets glittered upon the steep. They climbed and reached the summit of the ridge and disappeared. "Effendim!" Fateh broke into my meditations. "Effendim, the boat is ready." "Oh, Fateh," said I, "the Greeks are gone." Fateh looked vaguely disturbed. "The Greeks of old days who marched with us down the Euphrates," I explained. The history of the 10,000 is not included in the Aleppine curriculum, and since Fateh can neither read nor write, he is debarred from supplementing the acquirements of his brief school days. But he searched his memory for fragments of my meaningless talk. "Those?" he said. "God be with them." We had more reason to invoke the protection of the Almighty on our own behalf. The ferry-boat was packed with our baggage animals, standing head to tail. The current was very swift. We shot down it, heading aslant until we neared the further shore. The ferrymen thrust their long poles sharply into the water, and the boat heeled round until the gunwale touched the level of the stream. Thereat the horses tumbled over like ninepins, one upon the other, and I, sitting high in the stern, was saved by the timely clutch of a zaptieh from plunging headlong into the stream. Allah! Allah! cried the ferryman, and we ran aground upon the bank. The Tur Abdin, which we now entered, is a lofty plateau that stretches from Finnick on the east to Mardin and DIYARBEKR on the west, and south to Nizibin. The Tigris embraces it north and east. On its south side the heights of the plateau fall abruptly into the Mesopotamian deserts, which, interrupted only by the long hog's back of the Jebel Sinjar, extend to the Persian Gulf. The Mount of the Servants of God, such is the meaning of its beautiful name, was known to the ancients as Masius Mons and Izala Mons, Mount Izala occupying the eastern end of the plateau. This country lay upon the confines of the Roman and the Persian empires, and in the confused accounts of the campaigns of Constantius, Justinian, and Heraclius, the frontier fortresses of Izala and Masius play a conspicuous part. While war raged around Amida, Mard, Dara, and Nisibis, the secluded valleys of the Tur Abdin were falling peacefully into the hands of the servants of God. The mount was a stronghold of the Christian faith. Monastery after monastery rose among the oak woods, the rolling uplands were cleared and planted with vineyards, and the ancient communities of the Eastern Church multiplied and grew rich in their almost inaccessible retreat. Very little has been published concerning the architectural remains of the district, but I had happened to see in Mosul some photographs which had awakened my curiosity, and the Dominican fathers whom I met at Bavian had raised it still higher. The morning was half spent before we landed on the west bank of the Tigris. Our path climbed up onto the plateau and led us over downs, sweet-scented with clover and very thinly populated. During the 5 hours' journey from the Tigris to Azak, we saw only 3 villages. Azak, where we camped, is inhabited mainly by Jacobites, some of whom have modified their creed under the influence of American missionaries. The Protestant pastor paid me a visit and brought disquieting news. While we were still at Mosul, we had heard rumors of a massacre of the Christians which had taken place at Adana. The Tur Abdin was full of these reports. It was impossible to make out whether the events which were related to us were past or present, how serious the massacre had been, or whether it were now at an end. And it was not until I reached Caesarea that I learnt the truth with regard to the double outbreak in Cilicia. For a month we were greeted wherever we went with details of fresh calamities that were in part the reverberation of those of which we had already heard, and everywhere these histories were accompanied by the assurance that a deliberate attempt had been made from without to stir up massacres in the districts through which we passed. No direct proof of this statement was offered. I never met the man who had set eyes on the reported telegram, nor anyone who could tell me what signature it bore. But in the East, conviction does not wait upon evidence. I learnt to realize the evil power of rumor, and experience taught me how hard it is to keep the mind steadily fixed upon the proposition that 2 unsupported statements, or the same often repeated, will not make a certainty. The atmosphere of panic which surrounded us is the true precursor of disaster, and I found good reason to respect the statecraft of the Turkish officials, whose firmness saved the population from the consequences of their own loudly expressed suspicions. I bear testimony to the fact that all that I saw or heard of the agitation which attended the events of April 1909 led me to the conviction that the local authorities had set their face against bloodshed, and by doing so had averted it. Next morning we rode for 6 hours to Ba Sabrina, over wide uplands almost entirely uncultivated and covered with small oak trees. The country was so like the swelling, thinly wooded hills that lead out of the Belka towards the Syrian desert that at times I could have sworn that we were riding from Gilead into Moab. The characteristic feature of the Tur Abdin is the absence of streams. Even when we crossed a deep valley, as we did twice during the course of the morning, there was no running water in it. The water supply of the villages is derived from pools, which are fed by the winter rains and snows. In the second valley we found the ruined monastery of Mar Shimun, placed among thickets and deep herbage, but to my disappointment it was of little architectural interest. The village of Ba Sabrina is wholly Christian. It has been an important place, and though it has now fallen to the estate of a small hamlet, it contains innumerable monasteries. Several of these are beyond the limits of the town. They lie, each in its own enclosing wall, like small forts upon the hills, and each is garrisoned by a single monk. The monastic buildings are exiguous, and I doubt whether they can have been intended for more than 1 or 2 persons. Perhaps they should be regarded as clerical rather than as monastic foundations, and the living rooms were intended for the lodging of those who served the shrine. The first monastery, which we reached upon the outskirts of Ba Sabrina, was of this character. Its high and rather tapering rectangular tower and strong walls gave it from afar a striking appearance, but the vaulted chapel and the rooms set round a tiny court were rudely built of undressed stones, almost totally dark and devoid of decorative features. I looked at several of the monastic houses within the village, and always with the same results. They had no pretension to architectural interest, and were without ornament or inscriptions by which to determine their date. But at the monastery of Mar Dodo I found a clue to the history of Ba Sabrina. The church, which is the largest in the place, stands upon the north side of a walled court, round which are placed insignificant living rooms, storerooms, and stables. The church consists of a closed narthex, running along the south side of a vaulted, aisleless nave, with a single apse to the east. On the east side of the court, south of the church, there is an exedra, covered by a semi-dome and provided with a stone reading desk on which to set the holy books. All the masonry is rude and unskilful, and the carved capitals and molded arch of the exedra bear no sign of great antiquity, while the engaged capitals in the church are merely blocked out. Now this scheme of a single-chambered church, with a narthex to the south and an external exedra, filled me with amazement, for it was unlike any that I had seen. But I was subsequently to learn that it is one of the oldest ecclesiastical plans of the Tur Abdin, and its combination at Ba Sabrina with rough masonry and late decorative details is explained by a Syriac inscription above the porch which states that the church was built in the year 1510 of the Seleucid era, i.e. A.D. 1200. Whether this be the date of the first foundation, or of a fundamental reconstruction upon an older site, I cannot be certain, though from the absence of all trace of early work I incline to the former alternative, and I conclude that the old architectural scheme of the Tur Abdin was adhered to closely at a later date, when a second period of building activity saw the foundation of the churches and monasteries of Ba Sabrina. But since I did not then know that these edifices were exact copies of more ancient work, their recent date was a rude shock, and I began to wonder whether the mount would prove to be as fruitful a field as I had hoped. Ba Sabrina, at any rate, had been drawn blank, and we rode down for 3/4 of an hour through vineyards to the village of Sareh. As soon as we had settled upon a camping ground, no easy matter on account of the interminable vineyards, I walked down to the village to examine the church. The Aga of Sareh belongs to one of the leading Kurdish families of these parts. I found him in an open space near the church, entertaining friends who had ridden over from a neighboring village. They, too, were Agas of a noble house, and they were tricked out in all the finery which their birth warranted. Their short jackets were covered with embroidery, silver-mounted daggers were stuck into their girdles, and upon their heads they wore immense erections of white felt, wrapped round with a silken handkerchief, of which the ends stuck out like wings over their foreheads. They pressed me to accept several tame partridges, which they kept to lure the wild birds, and while we waited for the priest to bring the key of the church, they exhibited the very curious stela, which stands upside down in the courtyard. Meantime the village priest had arrived, and I followed him unsuspiciously into the church. But I had not stood for more than a minute inside the building, that I happened to look down onto the floor and perceived it to be black with fleas. I made a hasty exit, tore off my stockings, and plunged them into a tank of water, which offered the safest remedy in this emergency. "There are," said the priest apologetically, "a great many, but they are all swept out on Sunday morning. On Sunday there are none." I confess to a deep skepticism on this head. The end of section 16. Section 17 of Amurath to Amurath by Gertrude Bell. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Amurath to Amurath by Gertrude Bell. ZÂKHÅ to DIYARBEKR, continued. The incompleteness of the maps and the absence of trustworthy information led us far astray upon the following day. I had heard of a very ancient monastery that lay upon the outer edge of Tur Abdin. Upon the way thither I proposed to visit the castle of Hatim Tai. Accordingly I spread out Kipert, and drawing a bee-line across the blank paper, told Fatah to take the camp to Usadera. Kipert calls it Usaden, and provided him with a zaptieh and a guide. Another villager accompanied Yusuf and me and the second zaptieh, and undertook to guide us via the castle to Usadera. We set forth from Sareh at 5:30 and rode through uninhabited oak woods until 8:10, when we reached a ruined village, from which we could see the castle of Hatim Tai standing up boldly on the opposite side of a deep valley. There was no road by which to reach it, not so much as a bridle path. We struggled down through the woods, dragging our horses over rocks and fallen trees, and by the special mercy of Providence, reached at 9:15, and without accident, the foot of the castle hill. A path led round it to the Yazidi village of Gileya, and thither I sent Yusuf and the Zaptieh with horses, while the man of Sara climbed the hill with me. Hatim Tai was a renowned sheikh of the Arab tribe of the Tai, but the castle which is called after him has a far longer history. The summit of the hill is enclosed in a double line of fortification following the contours of the slopes. The lower ring is provided with towers at the angles of the wall, and with round bastions of very slight projection. Within the inner enclosure stands the citadel, now completely ruined and bearing evidences of frequent reconstruction. The oldest parts are unmistakably of Byzantine masonry, and contain a chapel of which the apse is well preserved. The castle must have been rebuilt during the Mohammedan period, and then again rebuilt, for in one of the walls of the citadel there is a fragment of an Arabic inscription, which is not in its original position, neither is the inscription complete. The Yazidis declared that the castle was one of their strongholds until it passed into the hands of the Tai, and this might account for a reconstruction of the citadel at a late period. The only other inscription which I could find is also Arabic. It's apparently a name, with no date or further qualification, cut upon the main gate of the outer wall. In the space between the two walls there are a number of small rock-hewn cisterns, some of which were probably intended to hold corn and other provisions. The main water supply was drawn from a large cistern in the citadel. So far as I could judge, the ruins therefore exhibit Yazidi or Arab work, or both, upon Byzantine foundations, and I think it exceedingly likely that the castle of Hatim Tai is that Rubdeum which, according to Procopius, was fortified by Justinian. It lay, says he, on a steep rock upon the frontiers of the Roman and the Persian empires, 2 days from Dara. Below it was the Ager Romanorum, which has been identified with the plain between Mosul and the Tur Abdin. Since there was no water near it, there is none, as I have said, in the Tur Abdin, Justinian was obliged to cut a number of cisterns. The whole of this description exactly fits the castle of Hatim Tai, and the presence of Byzantine masonry among the ruins is strongly in favor of the identification. The position of the fortress is exceedingly fine. The hills drop down sharply from its very walls into the Mesopotamian plain, where the long line of the Jebel Sinjar, a mountain occupied almost exclusively by the Yazidis, alone breaks the desolate expanse. A cruel disillusion awaited us when we reached the valley. The Yazidis, who were feasting Yusuf and the Zaptieh on bread and bowls of milk, declared that there was no getting to Usadera except by taking the path down into the plain and climbing up into the hills again by a pass at Khalat el-Jadid. Even the direction from which we had come was blocked to us, for we refused to contemplate a return through the woods down which we had pushed our way with so much difficulty. The Yazidis, who had heard from Yusuf that we had recently visited Ali Beg, begged us to stay the night in their caves. The village of Geliye is all underground, and offered to kill a sheep for us. And when I was obliged to decline this eagerly proffered hospitality, one of their number accompanied us for some distance to show us the way. Riding through oak woods where the bees had hived in every hollow trunk, we came to a small and dilapidated Yazidi shrine, where my guide paused to kiss the largest of the trees. "It belongs to the Ziara," he said in answer to my question. "We do not collect the honey out of any of these trees. All the wood here belongs to the Ziara." We left Geliye at 10:30, and in 2 hours found ourselves in the familiar Mesopotamian landscape, an interminable flat strewn with big mounds, each with its village near it. The climate, too, was familiar, and we rode wearily through a burning heat to which we had not thought to return. At 11:30 we passed near Kalka. At 12:30 we came to Kinnik, where we spent a half-hour trying to re-shoe one of our horses. But the farrier was dead, so we were informed, and though we had the shoe with us, the whole village could not produce a single nail. When once the Yazidi was gone, none of our party had any special knowledge of the way, but Kiepert, upon whom be praise, served us well, and with his help we hit off the valley which led up to Khalat el-Jadid, and at 5 o'clock we found ourselves, tired and hungry, under its towers. It soared above us, no less splendidly placed than Khalat Hatim Tai, and guarded this second pass just as Hatim Tai had guarded the other, If we had been certain that we should reach our camp before nightfall, I should have climbed up to it. But in the mountains no one can make a sure calculation of distances, and we dared not stay. I know nothing, therefore, of Khalad el-Jadid but its magnificent outer aspect, and it remains in my memory as a vision of wall and tower and precipitous rock rising into the ruddy sunset light above a shadowy gorge, a citadel as bold and menacing as any that I have seen. We led our horses up the rugged gorge, and at 6:40 regained the plateau of the Tur Abdin. A little village, BAGHDÂD, stood at the head of the pass, and before us stretched a rolling, thickly wooded country. We stopped at the village pool to inquire our way, and were given the general direction of Usadera, coupled with a vague assurance that it was not too far. The paths were too stony for riding, and to walk was a relief after so many hours of the saddle. I left my companions to bring on the horses and turned into the darkening oak woods. For close upon an hour I followed the course of a shallow, winding valley. The trees, standing close about the path, obscured all view. A brooding silence, unbroken by man or beast, hung over the forest. The dark deepened into cool, sweet-smelling night, and still the narrow, rocky path wound on between wooded banks. And just as I was wondering whether it had any end, the trees fell back round an open patch of corn and vine, and the lights of my camp shone out upon the further side. If we had traveled far in the body upon that day, we traveled further in the spirit upon the next. There lies upon the lip of the hills, overlooking the wide desolation of Mesopotamia, a monastery which is said to be the mother house of all the Tur Abdin. Into these solitudes, according to the tradition of the mountain, wandered at the beginning of the 4th century a pupil of St. Anthony, whose name was St. Eugenius. He learnt from his master the rule of solitude, and had overcome with him the devils that people the Egyptian sands. Among the rocks of Mount Izala he laid down his pilgrim staff, gathered disciples about him, and founded the monastery that still bears his name. It was at first no more than a group of cells hollowed out of a cliff, but as its fame increased, the monks built themselves a church upon a narrow shelf between precipice and precipice, and helped out the natural defenses of the mountain by a strong wall of masonry. The cave cells increased in number until the rocks were honeycombed on every side, and disciples of the first founder led forth companies of monks to raise fresh monasteries over the Tur Abdin. The Jacobite priest of Usadera, when he heard that we proposed to visit Mar Ogen, offered to accompany us, saying that he wished to pay his respects to the bishop who lived there. This was a figure of speech, for the bishop is not to be seen of any man, and he guided us for an hour through the woods to the southern edge of the hills. The path to the monastery was a rock-cut staircase, but we succeeded in dragging the horses down it, and left them by the gate. Under the crag stands the church with its tiny cloister and walled court, and it did not take long to discover that in spite of many rebuildings, the tradition as to its age could not be far wrong. A church must have stood here in the 6th century, if not in the 5th. Some of the old capitals have been reused at a later time, and the ancient plan is preserved in church and cloister. 10 monks are lodged in the rock-cut cells of their remote forerunners. I met with one of them in the cloister, and he carried intelligence of my arrival to the prior, who came in haste to do the honors of his church. He was a man of some 30 years of age, with melancholy eyes. We sat together in the shadow of the cloister, while he explained to me the rule under which he and his brethren lived, and as he spoke I felt the centuries drop away, and disclosed the ascetic life of the early Christian world. They spend their days in meditation. Their diet is bread and oil and lentils. No meat, and neither milk nor eggs may pass their lips. They may see no woman. But you may see me? I asked. We have made an exception for you, explained the prior. Travelers come here so seldom, but some of the monks have shut themselves into their cells until you go. The cell of St. Eugenius stands apart from the others, hollowed out of the cliff to the west of the church. The prior had spent a lonely winter there, seeing no one but the brother who brought him his daily meal of bread and lentils. As we stood in the narrow cave, which was more like a tomb than a dwelling place, I looked into the young face, marked with the lines drawn by solitude and hunger. "Where is your home?" I asked. "In Mardin," he answered. "My father and my mother live there yet." "Will you see them again?" said I. "Perhaps not," he replied, but there was no regret in his voice. "And all your days you will live here?" He looked out calmly over rock and plain. "Please God," he said, "it seems to be a good place for prayer." It is the habit of the monks to let no traveler depart without food, a habit well known to the neighboring Kurds who claim more hospitality than the monastery can well afford. While I worked at the church, the prior betook himself to the cave kitchen and prepared an ample meal of eggs and bread, raisin and sour curds for me and my men. When we had eaten, I asked whether it would not be seemly to thank the bishop for the entertainment which had been offered to us. "You cannot see him," said the prior. "He has left the world." "The Kas from Usadera came today to visit him," I objected. "He came to gaze upon his cell," answered the prior, and with that he led me out of the church and pointed to a cave some 50 feet above us in the cliff. 3/4 of the opening had been filled with masonry, and I could see that it was approached by a stair of which the lower part was cut out behind a gallery and the upper on the face of the rock. An active novice might have thought twice before attempting the path to the bishop's cell. "Is he old?" said I. "He is the father of 80 years, replied the prior, "and it is now a year since he took a vow of silence and renounced the world. Once a day at sunset he lets down a basket on a rope, and we place therein a small portion of bread." "And when he dies?" I asked. "When he is sick to death he will send down a written word telling us to come up on the next day and fetch his body. Then we shall see his face again." "And will you take his place?" said I. "If God wills," he answered. We walked across the hills for half an hour to Mar Johanna, a monastery founded by a disciple of St. Eugenius. It is neither so finely placed nor so interesting architecturally as Mar Aguen, although the rough walls of church and monastic building, which cling to the rocky slopes, are not without a certain wild beauty. The bishop who rules over the house of Mar Johanna is less exclusive than the prelate at Mar Augen, for he shares a tower with his 4 monks, but he was still too exclusive to receive my visit. The aged prior was all for serving us with a meal, but I could not undertake to dispose of another omelette, nor did I realize that my refusal would be regarded as a shocking breach of the social code. The prior was so deeply hurt that he would not bid us farewell, and we left under the cloud of his displeasure. We climbed back to the summit of the hills and rode home to Usadera, and if anyone should wonder why a recluse from Egypt should have sought so distant a dwelling place as Mount Izala, I can give a sufficient answer. It was because he found Iris Susiana growing among the rocks. The great gray flowers lift their heads in every open space between the oak trees, gleaming silver in the strong sun, and so perfect are they in form, so exquisite in texture, that I stood amazed at the sight of them, as one who gazes on a celestial vision. It is just an hour's ride from Usadera to Mar Melko, which stands fortress-like upon the top of a hill. The bishop, for there was a bishop here also, the number of prelates in the Tur Abdin is scarcely to be reckoned, was singularly unlike his colleagues of the other monasteries. He carried sociability to so high a point that I doubted whether I should be allowed to proceed that day upon my journey. But with the regrettable incident at Mar Johanna fresh in my memory, I put force upon my appetite and ate the second breakfast upon which his hospitality insisted, while the Zaptia and Yusuf, who were not in the habit of counting breakfasts, did fuller justice to the remains of it. The monastery is a rambling building with a chapel upon an upper floor, and a crypt containing the tombs of priors. The tomb of the patron saint is in the church itself. Over it hangs a rude picture of Mar Melko, with the devil beside him. Upon inquiry, the bishop explained that the saint had been renowned for his power of casting out devils, and he pointed to a collar and chain attached to the wall, and observed that men who were afflicted with fits or madness came here to be cured, and all went away sound, no matter what their creed. The buildings bore evidences of frequent reconstruction, and parts of the church were still in the state of ruin in which a recent Kurdish raid had left them. It is almost impossible to date architecture of this kind, for the new work and the old have much the same character, but the plan of the church is the ancient monastic scheme, as I learned at Mar Gabriel and at Salah, and in all probability Mar Melko is to be counted among the oldest foundations of the Tur Abdin. Like Mar Gabriel, it is some distance removed from the nearest village, and depends for its security upon its own strong walls. After we had passed through Karaba Ale, which contains the ruins of a church, we wandered among the rolling wooded hills, and had gone needlessly far to the north before we caught sight of the monastery of Mar Gabriel standing upon an eminence, with my tents pitched beside it. The inevitable bishop was away, and I could not regret his absence, since it implied a relaxation of the social duties which I should otherwise have been obliged to fulfill, and permitted me to give my whole attention to the building. The house of St. Gabriel of Cartmine was, during the Middle Ages, the most famous and the richest of Jacobite establishments. It is said to have been founded in the reign of Arcadius, 395 to 408, and rebuilt under Anastasius, 491 to 518, and I see no reason to doubt that the great church of Mar Gabriel is, as it now stands, a work of the early 6th century. There are two other churches within the existing monastic precincts, one dedicated to the Virgin, the other to the 40 martyrs, but neither of these is as old as that which is dedicated to the tutelary saint. A large area of ruins beyond the walls gives some indication of the former magnificence of the monastery, which gained, as early as the days of Justinian, a reputation for holiness, second only to Jerusalem. It bore at that period the name of St. Stephen. St. Gabriel was bishop of the monastery during the reign of Heraclius. When the Arab invaders drove out the forces of the Byzantine Empire, he obtained from the Caliph Umar ibn al-Khattab rights of jurisdiction over all Christians in the Tur Abdin, for which reason the monastery is sometimes called after him, Deir Mar Gabriel, and sometimes after the Caliph, Deir Umar. It was despoiled by Timur towards the close of the 14th century, and many a harrying it must have endured from the Kurds before it sank into its present state of poverty and decay. One monk and a single nun, well stricken in years, were its sole occupants at the time of my visit. The church of Mar Gabriel is built upon a plan which I conjecture to be monastic, as distinguished from parochial. The two types, which are quite unlike each other, are also unlike all churches known to me outside the Tur Abdin. The parish church, which has no domestic buildings attached to it, or nothing but a few chambers for the lodging of clerks, follows invariably the plan that I have described at Ba Sabrina. At Mar Gabriel and in the other monastic churches, the atrium and narthex lie to the west, the vaulted nave is placed with its greater length running from north to south, and 3 doors in the east wall communicate with a triple sanctuary. From what prototypes did the Christian architects of the Tur Abdin derive the singular feature of the nave lying with its greater length at right angles to the main axis of the building? I can only suggest that they may have preserved the ancient scheme of the Babylonian temple and palace hall, which was retained by the Assyrians in their palaces, but not in their temples. And if this be so, the monastic churches of the Tur Abdin are the last representatives of the oldest Oriental architecture. The walls and vault of the nave of Mar Gabriel are devoid of ornament, but the vault of the central sanctuary is adorned with mosaics. The accumulated soot of centuries of candle smoke has not entirely obscured the glory of its golden ground, of the great jeweled cross laid over the center of the vault, and the twisted vine scrolls with which it is encircled. It is said that similar mosaics once covered the whole church, and were destroyed by the soldiers of Timur. We rode next morning into Midyad, and camped beside the ruined church of Mar Philoxenos, which, since it has not been recently repaired, is of greater interest than any other in the town. The task of planning it was a labor of hatred. The population of Midyad, men, women, and children, stationed themselves upon the ruined walls, and for them it was no doubt the most entertaining afternoon which they had spent for many a long week. But for me, and for the patient bearers of the measuring tape, the hours were charged with exasperation. The Kaimakam, when he appeared upon this agitated scene, Midyad is the seat of government in the Tur Abdin, succeeded in clearing the ruins for a few moments, but as soon as he had turned his back, the hordes reassembled with a greater zest than before. My Christian servants returned in the evening from the bazaar, gravely disquieted by the gossip which was current there. It was rumored that the wave of massacre had spread to Aleppo, and they trembled for the fate of their wives and families. The news which was causing us so much anxiety was, in fact, nearly a month old, but we did not learn until we reached DIYARBEKR that Aleppo had escaped with a week of panic. The next day was devoted to 3 churches which I visited and planned on the way to Kach, Mar Yaqub at Salah, Mar Kyriakos at Arnas, and Mar Azizia at Keferzeh. I doubt whether there exists anywhere a group of buildings more precious to the archaeologist than these 3 churches, and the little domed shrine of the Virgin which stands almost perfect among the ruins of Kach. It is close upon a miracle that in this forgotten region, long subjected to the tyranny of the Kurds, such masterpieces of architecture should have escaped destruction. The explanation is probably to be found in the rugged mountain frontiers of the Tur Abdin. Even though it lay upon the edge of the country, which was for over 100 years the battleground of the Persian and the Byzantine, war seems to have penetrated but little into its heart. The Christian communities from their rock-cut cells in the crags of Mount Izala must have listened to the rumors of advance and flight and siege. They could almost witness the encounter of armies in the plain below. But the lofty mountain, precipitous and almost inaccessible, as Procopius describes it, was a sure refuge, and Procopius himself can scarcely have been acquainted with the wooded uplands and fertile valleys where already in his time stood the churches and monasteries of Salah and Arnas, Kefrze and Kach. The Arab conquerors left the Christians undisturbed. They bowed the head and suffered under the fierce blast of Timur's invasion and under the secular persecution of the Kurds. But decimated and stripped of their wealth, they held firmly to the bare walls of their religious houses, and the meager, ragged choirs still chant their litanies under vaults which have withstood the assault of 14 centuries. Into this country I came, entirely ignorant of its architectural wealth, because it was entirely unrecorded. None of the inscriptions collected by Pognon go back earlier than the 9th century. The plans which had been published were lamentably insufficient and were unaccompanied by any photographs. When I entered Mar Yaqub at Salah and saw upon its walls mouldings and carved string horses which bore the sign manual of the Greco-Asiatic civilization, I scarcely dared to trust to the conclusions to which they pointed. But church after church confirmed and strengthened them. The chancel arches, covered with an exquisite lacework of ornament, the delicate grace of the acanthus capitals, hung with garlands and enriched with woven entrelac, the repetition of ancient plans and the mastery of constructive problems, which revealed an old architectural tradition, all these assure to the churches of the Tur Abdin the recognition of their honorable place in the history of the arts. It was evening when we rode over the last of the wooded hills and saw the village of Kach lying upon a green knoll in the midst of a fertile plain. The rays of the setting sun touched the dome of the Church of the Virgin, the tower of Mar Sobo, and the terraced houses. They flashed upon the pool below the village, by the edge of which my camp was pitched, and were mercifully unrevealing of poverty and ruin. It seemed to me that I had ended the most wonderful day since that which had brought me to Uqadir, by dropping into a village of the 5th century, complete and prosperous in every part. The searching light of morning disclosed a different picture. The houses were mere hovels, and except for the Church of the Virgin, not one of the ancient buildings but had fallen into the extremity of decay. That church is, however, the jewel of the Tur Abdin. It has suffered scarcely any change since the builders completed it, and it points a way to the solution of many a problem of Byzantine architecture. Its plan suggests a memorial rather than a monastic type. The domestic buildings near it are small and modern, and I saw no trace of an ancient monastic house. A nun and the village priest occupied the rooms that now stand to the north of the courtyard. The nun was young and personable, and she found the religious life very much to her taste. Her sacred calling gave her the right to come and go as she pleased, to mix in male society, and even to put forth her opinion in male councils. Moreover, it provided her with an excuse for claiming audience of me on the evening of my arrival. "I have come to see my sister," I heard her announce. "Does she speak Arabic?" And before Fatou could answer, she had presented herself at the tent door. The object of her visit was to ask me for a revolver. "What do you want with a revolver?" I said. "We are all afraid," she replied. "We are all afraid of massacre." The little community of Jacobites snatch their daily bread from field and vineyard which lie at the mercy of marauding Kurds, whose practices were not, unfortunately, to remain for us a matter of hearsay. The second night at Kach was marked by the only misadventure that has befallen me in Turkey. We had intended to leave the village early on the following morning, and everything was prepared for our departure. Even my saddlebags, duly packed with notebooks and camera, were lying ready in my tent. In the middle of the night I was awakened by a rustling noise, and starting up I saw the figure of a man crouched in the doorway. We had grown careless with months of safe journeying in dangerous places, and neither Fatou nor I had taken the trouble to set a guard over the camp. The thieves had found us an easy prey. Before the servants and zaptiehs were roused, they had made off into the night, and we were left to reckon up our loss. What money I had with me had been taken out of my tent, the servants had been robbed of all their spare clothing, and various other small objects were missing, but the real disaster was the disappearance of the saddlebags which contained my notebooks. We stood helpless, gazing into the darkness into which had vanished the results of 4 months' work. A rifle shot, fired by Selim, had awakened the priest, who came hurrying down to inquire into our case. Deeply distressed was he, poor man, to hear of our misfortune, for we were the guests of the village, and he feared that ill might fall upon him and his flock for suffering us to come to harm. I listened to a great deal of divergent advice, and finally decided to send for the Chalabi, who is the feudal chief of the Kurdish tribes in the Tur Abdin. Accordingly, at the first dawn, Fateh and his aptieh were dispatched across the hills to bear him the news. A certain village lay under suspicion, a little robber's nest situated in the depths of a wild and rocky valley a few miles to the east. The people of Kak were well used to the depredations of the men of Zakhoran, and during the course of the day we were provided with more positive evidence against them. It chanced that the thieves had carried off a parcel of my gloves, and these they shed along the path as they ran. Gloves lying upon the rocky ways of the Tur Abdin are exceptional objects, and the path by which they were found was that which led to Zakhoran. Evening brought the Chalabi, pacing sedately upon his mare with 20 men behind him, all dressed in white garments and armed with rifles. I went out to welcome them, and brought their leader to my tents, where he listened to my tale over a cup of coffee, and gave me many assurances of redress. This done, he repaired with great dignity to the roof of the priest's house, converted for the time into a court of justice, and received until late into the night deputations from the neighboring villages. Next day the judgment seat was removed to Zakhoran, and Fateh went with it, as witness to the crime and representative of the plaintiff. At dusk he returned and reported that the Chalabi had arrested 4 men, selected, so far as could be ascertained, by empirical methods from among the inhabitants of the district, but that no clue had been found to the missing notebooks. It was now time to invoke a higher power, and I entrusted a Zeptieh with a letter to the Kaimakam of Midyad, and with a telegram which was to be sent from Midyad to the Vali at Diyarbekr. The Kaimakam entered into the business like a man. On the following evening 10 Zeptiehs arrived from Midyad, and next morning 50 foot soldiers marched into our camp. The nature of evidence is not clearly grasped in the East, and by the 3rd day after the robbery there was no person in the countryside, except, I believe, myself, against whom a charge of complicity had not been raised. But there continued to be no further proof than that which we had had from the beginning, and it pointed to Zakhoran. To Zakhoran, therefore, the miniature army took its way, leaving me divided between regret for the disturbance which my own carelessness had brought about, and gratitude for the goodwill displayed on every side. So difficult, however, had it become to protect the innocent, that, but for the notebooks, I should have left the guilty in peace. My servants were plunged in grief. Their honor was gone, indeed whose honor was left intact, and in sackcloth and ashes we passed the day. And then, in the grey dawn, we were awakened by a voice shouting from the hills, "Your goods are here! Your goods are here!" Every man in the camp leapt up and ran in the direction of the sound, and there, lying upon a rock among the oak scrub, was all that we had lost. Nothing had been injured, nothing was missing, except some money, which was subsequently refunded to me by the Ottoman government at the insistence of the British vice-consul in Diyarbekr, and it may well be questioned whether any government would have recognized a like liability. The villagers of Kak assembled around their tents, and shed tears of thankfulness over the recovered objects, and I mounted in haste and rode off to Zakhoran to set a term to the pursuit of criminals. The cause of the restitution was there apparent. The village was deserted. Men, women, and children had fled into the hills, taking with them all that they possessed, and it was reported by a picket that the Chalabi and the soldiers were engaged in capturing the flocks of the community. I sent a messenger after them and rode myself to Midyad to ask for a universal amnesty. Revenge is not so sweet as it is said to be, nor is it so easy when wrong is afoot to determine who is the more wronged. 2 days and a half of journeying brought us to Diyarbekr. The way was without interest except for that which was supplied by the dragoman of the British consulate, who had come to Midyad to help me out of difficulties. A cheerful traveling companion he proved, and well informed. We camped on the 2nd evening under the mound of Kark, not far from the Tigris, and shortened our way next day by fording the river, which was now a shallow stream, and cutting across a wide bend. This route had the advantage of giving us a first view of Diyarbekr under its finest aspect. It stands upon the high crest of the Tigris bank, a great fenced city built of basalt. Black are the dogs, and black the walls, and black the hearts of Black Amid, says the proverb. Since the days when Ammianus Marcellinus took part in the desperate resistance to Sapor, and watched from the towers of Amida the Persian hosts collected for the conflagration of the Roman world, the din of battle has never been far from Diyarbekr. The town passed to and fro between the Byzantine and the Sasanian. Constantius fortified it and lost it to Sapor. Anastasius recaptured it and lost it to Kobad and won it back. Justinian rebuilt the fortifications, but it fell with Mesopotamia to the Muslim invaders. The Kurdish Marwans made it their capital, and after them the Turkman Ortukids. Timur burst through the famous walls and put the inhabitants to the sword, and finally the Turk conquered it in AD 1515 and holds it still. But there is no peace for the lawless capital of Kurdistan. Warring faiths struggle together as fiercely as rival empires, and the conflict is embittered by race hatreds. The heavy air, lying stagnant between the high walls, is charged with memories of the massacres of 1895, and when I was in Diyarbekir, the news from Cilicia had rekindled animosity and fear. Muslim and Christian were equally persuaded that the other was watching for an opportunity to spring at his throat. Tales of fresh outbreaks in different parts of the empire were constantly circulated in the bazaars, and the men who listened went home and fingered at their rifles. If there had been any sign of further disturbance at Constantinople, Diyarbekir would have run with blood. With the population in this temper, it would have been futile to inquire into the prospects of constitutional government. I spent a day among ancient churches, and a day upon the walls, which are as fine an example of medieval fortification as any that exists. They hang upon the south and southeast sides, high over the Tigris. It was from this direction that Sapor's troops effected an entry through a hollow passage that led down to the water's edge. On the southwest they crown a slope set thick with gardens of mulberry and vine, and towards the north the wall bends round to join the curve of the river. 4 great gateways break this circuit. The Mardin Gate commands the terraced gardens, and the road that passes through it runs down to an ancient bridge over the Tigris. To the northwest and north, the Aleppo, or Mountain Gate, and the Kharput Gate open onto a fertile plain, and the Yeni Kapı, the New Gate, stands above the precipitous southern bank. The lie of the ground makes it certain that the oldest fortifications of the city must have occupied much the same position as those which still surround it, and though the latter are proved by numerous inscriptions to be Mohammedan work of different periods, I should judge them to be built mainly upon ancient foundations. The north wall with its round towers is perfectly preserved. Even the domed chambers inside the towers, together with the stairs that gave access to the chemin de ronde, are intact. All the arches and domes in the interior of the towers are of brick. Between the Kharput and the Aleppo gates a small aqueduct brings water to the town, the few springs within the walls being unpleasantly brackish. The citadel commands the northeast angle above the river. Most of the space surrounded by its enclosing wall is occupied by modern buildings and by a mound whereon stood the castle of the first Mohammedan princes. The domed arsenal is said to have been a Christian church, but remembering my unsuccessful attempts to visit the arsenal at Baghdad, I did not ask permission to enter it. From a postern gate in the north wall a road leads down to the river, passing under a cliff out of which gushes a sulphurous spring. As I watched the soldiers of the garrison washing their clothes in its waters, I tried to reconcile it with the rich spring, drinkable indeed, but often tainted with hot vapors, which Ammianus Marcellinus describes as rising under the citadel, and to see the men of the 5th Parthian Legion in the ragged groups standing about it. From the citadel we walked to the Mardin Gate, along the chemin de ronde, a fine course lifted high above the close air of the city and swept by breezes that come down from Taurus. Between the Aleppo Gate and the Mardin Gate stand 2 huge round towers, larger than any others and later in date. Near the Mardin Gate, the chemin de ronde is for some distance vaulted over and lighted only by small loophole windows on the inner side. To the south of the Mardin Gate the wall runs out abruptly, and the salient angle thus formed holds a great hall of which the vault is borne on columns. The 2 main streets lie from gate to gate, intersecting each other at right angles, and since this is in accordance with an ancient scheme of city planning, the line of the streets may be as old as the first foundation of the town. Not far from the point of intersection stands the Ulu Jami, with its famous courtyard enclosed to east and west by a 2-storied portico, which has been conjectured to be either the remains of a church built by Heraclius or a Byzantine palace. The buildings need a more exhaustive study than the fanaticism of the Mohammedan population will at present admit, and the correct plan of mosque and court has yet to be made. The older part of the work is closely related to the ancient architecture of the Tur Abdin. Even this hasty survey of Diyarbekir was sufficient to convince me that the treasures which it contains are still unexplored. Of its many mosques, Only the Ulu Jami has been so much as photographed, though the square minarets scattered over the town are probably an indication of an early date. Once or twice, as I walked in the bazaars, I looked through gateways into the courts of splendid khans, where the walls were decorated with contrasted patterns in limestone and basalt, and stripes of black and white masonry are used in many of the houses and mosques. The final history of Amida must wait upon a much more careful investigation of the town than any which has yet been undertaken. The end of section 17. Chapter 18 of Amurath to Amurath. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Amurath to Amurath by Gertrude Bell. Chapter 18, DIYARBEKR to Konia, June 4 to July 1. The frontier between the Arabic and Turkish-speaking peoples is not sharply defined. Through the southern parts of the Kurdish hills it is common to find men acquainted with one or both languages in addition to their native Kurdish. Among the Christians of the Tur Abdin, a knowledge of Syriac is not rare. In Diyarbekr, where there is a considerable Arab population, Arabic, Turkish, and Kurdish are spoken about equally, but north of Diyarbekr Arabic ceases to be heard, and as we journeyed along the road from Karput to Malatya, Kurdish died out also. Fatih, in addition to many other qualifications for travel, speaks Turkish fluently, though in a manner peculiar to himself. The muleteers who were with me had some knowledge of the language, and I have enough to wish that I had more of that singularly beautiful and flexible tongue. Thus equipped, we set out to make our way across Taurus and Anti-Taurus onto the Anatolian plateau. As far as Malatya, we followed the high road which led us at first across a fertile plain, celebrated for its gardens ever since the days of Ammianus Marcellinus. Outside the village of Tamur, we spent the night somewhat uneasily by reason of certain wedding festivities which were there in progress. Not only did the merrymakers keep up their rejoicings until close upon dawn, but the inhabitants of a neighboring village judged the occasion to be propitious for mule lifting, and were driven off with rifle shots. Peace was restored by daybreak, and the marriage procession conveying the bride to her husband's house set off to the strains of fife and drum. We passed it upon the road, a motley crowd, mounted and afoot. The bride was enveloped in a silken cloak of vivid magenta, which will not, I fear, be needed again for many a long day if her opportunities for wearing of finery may be measured by the aspect of her future home. For a more poverty-stricken collection of hovels than the bridegroom's village, it would be difficult to picture. We left her in her brief glory to take up her daily task of preventing her husband's roof from falling about her ears, and rode on to the hill of Argana, a bold spur of the Taurus mountains, with a village perched among its crags. I sent the baggage animals along the carriage road and climbed with a Cbteddy to the village, and thence by a steep path to the Armenian monastery of the Virgin, which stands on the summit of the rocks. We were rewarded by a magnificent view and by a pleasant talk with the prior, who informed me, as I drank his excellent coffee, that the monastery was founded in the 1st century of the Christian era, a tradition which calls for weightier confirmation than any which he advanced. Be that as it may, the existing house must have been largely rebuilt in the Middle Ages, perhaps towards the 14th century. I hazard this date on the evidence supplied by the decoration of the church, which had the character of Mohammedan work of about that period. We led our horses down the north side of the hill, by a stony path that ran between bramble hedges enclosing fruit gardens, rejoined the carriage road and crossed the Maden Chai, which is the local name for the main arm of the Tigris, by a bridge near Kalender Khan. We had now fairly entered into the mountains, and our road took us over high bare ridges and down again to the Maden Chai at the village of Argana Maden, the mines of Argana. On a shelf of the opposite hillside, the smoke drifted perpetually from the smelting furnaces of the richest copper mines in Turkey. The metal, smelted on the site, is cast into discs, 2 of which go to a camel load and sent across the hills to Diyarbekr and Caesarea, Sivas and Tokat. The valley of the Maden Chai, where the village lies, is so narrow that it offers no camping ground. We lodged, therefore, in a charming khan above the village by the water's edge. But for the fact that it was innocent of furniture, I could have fancied myself in an English country inn by the side of a rushing trout stream. The rain fell heavily in the night, and we rode for the greater part of the next day through an alternate drizzle and downpour, and were unable to determine which we enjoyed the most. The river cuts here through a deep rocky gorge, and the road climbs up by the side of the stream. The mists, clinging to the precipitous slopes, added to the somber grandeur of a pass which opened at its upper end onto an exquisite little fertile plain, set like a jewel among the hills. Through its cornfields the infant Tigris, a rippling brook, wandered from willow clump to willow clump. We parted from it 2 hours from its source and set our faces towards the hills which divide it from its mightier brother, the Euphrates. At their foot lies the little lake, Goljik, encircled by peaks, of which the northern slopes were white with snow patches. It is slightly brackish, and its waters have no outlet. We turned aside from the carriage road and took a bridle path along the northern side of the lake, and up the hills beyond it. Before we reached the crest of the slopes, we struck the road again, and by it crossed the water parting, and saw below us the rich and smiling plain of Kharput bounded by mountains, through which wound the silver streak of the Euphrates. We camped that night at the foot of the pass in the Armenian village of Kvank, our tents being advantageously placed in a grove of mulberry trees, loaded with ripe fruit. Kharput, or rather the lower town, Mezre, which is the seat of government of the vilayet of Mamouret el Aziz, lies 3 hours from Kvank. The plain between is exceedingly fertile. It is scattered over with villages, about half of which are inhabited by Armenians, who suffered cruelly in the massacres of 1895. At Kezarik, half an hour to the southeast of Mezre, 2 finely cut inscriptions, commemorating the expedition of Domitius Corbulo in AD 65, are built into the walls of a ruined church. They are well known, but I, coming from far beyond the limits of the Roman Empire, turned aside with pious enthusiasm and read the high-sounding titles of Nero, as one who glories in their achievements of his own people. Nero, Claudius, Caesar, Augustus, Germanicus, Imperator, Pontifex, Maximus. The words rang out with greater splendor from those remote stones than from any lying within the walls of Rome. Kharput is set upon the summit of the hills beyond Mezre. The castle, standing upon the highest crag, guards a shallow ravine wherein is stretched the greater part of the town, but the houses climb up onto the rocky headlands overhanging the plain, and, from below, the mountain seems to be crowned with a series of fortresses. The streets are so narrow that a cart can hardly pass along the cobbled ways. Very silent and peaceful they seemed, the shops heaped with cherries, the cool breezes stirring the vine tendrils that wreathed together overhead. The castle, for all its frowning walls and bastions, is nothing but a heap of ruins within. I looked in vain for the dungeons in which Sukman, the son of the Turkman officer Ortuk, founder of the Ortukid dynasties, imprisoned Baldwin of Edessa and Jocelyn of Courtenay in the early years of the 12th century. The Crusaders, gathering together their forces, seized the fortress in 1123 and held it until Balak, Ortuk's grandson, recaptured it and threw the garrison over the battlemented rock into the plain below. On an inner wall not far from the gate there are traces of an Arabic inscription, together with 2 stones carved in relief, the one bearing a lion and the other a ram, memorials, I make no doubt, of the Ortukid rule. The walls are of many periods of building. The masonry of one of the eastern towers is laid in alternate stripes of red and white stone. The eastern side of the hill drops steeply into a deep valley filled with houses which are terraced one above the other. Here there is a Jacobite church of ancient origin, its plan repeating the old scheme of the parochial church of the Tur Abdin. The priest assured me that it dated from the 1st century, and in proof of his assertion showed me a couple of curious oil paintings, a crucifixion and a Virgin and Child, Byzantine in type, so far as I could make out through the dust of ages. My tents were pitched on the plain near Mezre. There in the evening I received the Vali, a cheerful Cretan, and the Muavin Vali, and after they had departed, several other visitors. Their conversation left me groping my way through the intricate labyrinths of the Oriental mind, and even more bewildered than usual. Kharput and Mezre and the villages of the plain had felt yet more sharply than Diyarbekr and the Tur Abdin the wave of panic that had emanated from Cilicia. 3 days after the first outbreak at Adana, the Kurdish peasants had trooped into the Christian villages and announced their intention to kill, while in Mezre the valley was besieged by demands that he should give the signal for massacre. To his credit, be it recorded that he held out against these appeals, though the abject terror of the Armenians did much to increase the danger of the situation. When the news of Abul Hamid's deposition reached the vilayet, the agitation went out like a candle in the wind. The Kurds returned peaceably to their houses, and the fears of the Christians were allayed. This was strange enough, but that which followed was stranger still. The district had suffered during the spring from lack of rain, and the drought became at length so serious that the whole harvest was threatened. The leading mullah of Meseret called upon the people to assemble in a neighboring village, where there was a much-respected Mohammedan shrine, that they might raise a common supplication for rain. The population answered his call to a man, Christian and Moslem, who but 5 weeks before had with difficulty been restrained from leaping at each other's throats, stood side by side and listened to the sermon which the mullah delivered to them. All, said he, were brothers, all were children of one God, all alike were in danger of perishing from the drought, and it behooved all to pray together for the beneficent rain which would save them from famine. His eloquence reduced the assembled audience to tears, and for 3 days their united orisons rose to heaven. And then the miracle came to pass. The rain fell abundantly, that same rain over which we had rejoiced in the Tigris Gorge without knowing that we owed it to the prayers of the Moslems and Christians of Kharput, nor yet how many fevers it was assuaging, more fatal than the sun fever in our veins, for it was admitted that this most fortunate coincidence would do more to bring about amity than the fall of many sultans. I sat long into the night and gazed upon the shattered crags of Kharput and the hollow plain, clothed in abundance of fruits and sheltered by its ring of noble hills. What is it that leads to massacre? Whence does that sudden frenzy spring, whither vanish? Like a tornado it bursts over the peaceful earth, blots out the daily life of town and village, destroys, uproots, and slays, and passes. My thoughts were still busy with these unanswerable problems when we rode upon our way next morning. One of my muleteers was a Moslem, a Haji, a Mecca pilgrim. I had known him for many years, and he had served me well during months of hard travel. When the road was long, he had not wearied. When the sun was hot, he had not complained. When the wind blew cold, he drew more closely about him the duffel coat which I had given him in Aleppo, and every evening after the tents were pitched and the horses picketed, I had seen him building up the fire under the big rice pot and stirring the savory mess on which my camp was to sup. Today, as I looked into his simple, honest face, I wondered what unexpected ferocity lay behind its familiar wrinkles. "Haj Amur," I said, "in the day of slaughter, would you kill me?" "My lady, no," he replied, "not you. I have eaten your bread." "Would you kill Fatua and Selim and Yusuf?" I asked. "No, no," said he, "not them. We are brothers." "But other Christians would you slay?" "Voilà," he answered, "in the day of slaughter." I ceased my questionings and rode on, but the subject was to come up again. It happened in this manner. We had journeyed over the plain to Khan Kui and climbed on to a low spur of the hills. Having crossed it, we rode down a long valley with high hills on either hand. It chanced that Fatah and I and a Zaptieh were on ahead, and as we went we fell into talk. Now, Fatah is a Catholic Armenian, and in the old days we've experienced many a difficulty over his teskera, owing to the ominous word Armenian which is inscribed upon it. At the end of the last journey he had vowed that he would change his faith, which does not sit very heavily upon him, Fatah being a philosopher touching the finer distinctions of creed, and I now asked him whether he had carried out this determination. "Effendim," he replied, "2 years ago, when I returned to Aleppo, I told the bishop that I would become Protestant or Latin, Protestant or Roman Catholic, and he argued with me and said he would send a priest to pray with me. But I said, no, for I and my family are Protestant." "And are you a Protestant?" said I. "God knows," replied Fatah. "On my teskera I am still written down a Catholic Armenian, but that I cannot be, for I refused to let the priest come into my house to pray. Therefore I belong to no religion, but the religion of God." "We all belong to that religion," said I. "True, voilà," said the Zaptieh. Presently there came up the road towards us a train of loaded camels. "These are men of Kasaria," said Fatah. "I know them by their dress." And as the first string of camels drew near, he shouted to the man sitting half asleep upon the leading animal, "Are you from the port of Beilan?" "Evet, evet," he answered drowsily, and his body rocked with the long rocking of the camel's stride as they plodded past. "Nazl Kirk Khan," cried Fatah. "How does Kirk Khan?" Kirk Khan is a Christian village at the foot of the Beilan Pass, between Aleppo and Alexandretta. The next cameleer had come up with his string, and he answered the question. "The Gaur are all killed," he answered, taking Fatah for a Moslem. "And how are the houses of the Gaur?" Fatah called out. The leader of the next string answered, "They are all burnt." "Praise God," said Fateh, and the Zaptieh laughed. When the camel train had passed, I said, "Why did you call the people of Kirk Khan infidels?" "Because the camel driver called them so," Fateh replied. "And why did you praise God?" "Effendim, they praised God when they saw Kirk Khan in ashes, and they rejoiced to tell the tale. What else should I say?" He rode on silently for a few minutes, and then he added, "All the men of Kirk Khan were my friends. Every time I drove my carriage from Aleppo to Alexandretta, I stopped to eat with them, and they, when they were in Aleppo, came to my house. Now they are dead. God have mercy on them." His sorrowful acceptance of an outrage, which the Western mind, accustomed to regarding the protecting of human life as the first obligation of society, refused to contemplate, revealed to me the magnitude of the gulf which I had been attempting to bridge, and as I followed the channel of Fateh's thought, I saw fate, in the likeness of a camel train, moving slow and heavy-footed towards the inevitable goal. Our road climbed over a bluff and dropped again into a ravine, at the lower end of which stands Komar Khan, an old red-roofed caravanserai, stately in decay. Near to it flows the Murad Su, which is the Euphrates, and though we were now far from its Mesopotamian reaches, it was already a great river, whose waters had received the tribute of many snows. Below Komar Khan it enters a narrow gorge, where the hills fall sheer into the water, and above the Khan, carved upon a slab of rock, a Vannic inscription bears witness to the high antiquity of the road. The ferry is a couple of hours further upstream, but we reached it late in the afternoon and were too weary to cross that night. We pitched our tents on the bank. It was our last Euphrates camp, opposite the village and the great mound of Izoglu. The next day's ride took us over hill and dale to Malatya. The road was planted with mulberry trees that dropped their ripe fruit at our feet. The swelling slopes were deep in corn, and water-loving poplars stood in the meadows at the valley bottoms. I do not think that we broke the record of travel upon this stage. There were too many temptations urging us to loiter. Modern Malatya occupies the site of Azbuzu, a village which was once the summer quarters of the parent city. In 1838, during the war between Turkey and Egypt, Azbuzu became the headquarters of the Turkish general, Hafiz Pasha. Old Malatya, which is situated about 2 hours to the northwest, was at that time in great part destroyed for the enlarging of Azbuzu, and has since lain deserted and almost uninhabited. Moltke, who joined the Turkish army in 1838 and remained with it for a year, describes the wonderful luxuriance of the gardens of Azbuzu in his enchanting volume of letters, the most delightful book that has ever been written about Turkey, with the sole exception of Eothen. The gardens are no less exquisite now than they were in his time, and as we rode down the hillside the houses were scarcely to be seen through their screen of fruit trees. Even upon a nearer view the walnuts and mulberries are far more striking than the buildings of Malatya, which are constructed, as Moltke says, out of exactly the same material as that with which the swallows make their nests. We camped in the midst of poppy fields by one of the many streams for which Malatya is famous, and I spent the afternoon exploring the town, but could find nothing of interest in it except some Hittite reliefs which had been brought from Arslan Tepe. I had already determined to visit old Malatya, and the sight of these stones sent me round by the mound from which they had come. We rode for a half an hour through gardens to Ordasu, itself buried in gardens, and thence to a ruined monastery, a quarter of an hour up the hillside. A small chapel has been patched together in the north aisle of the original church. Slabs carved with Latin crosses, or with the Greek cross encircled by a victor's wreath, lay about among the ruins or were built into the walls, and upon the piers of the old nave the capitals were roughly carved with acanthus. None of this work seemed to me to be earlier than the 8th or 9th centuries, but I saw in the grass-grown court finely molded column bases which were of earlier date. They may have been brought from the city of Melatin, which was the forerunner of old Malatya. An hour's ride from the monastery stands the big mound of Arslan Tepe, surrounded by gardens and poppy fields. Without the evidence of the reliefs, it might have been conjectured to represent a Hittite city. The wide fertile valley in which it is placed, the backing of hills, the open plain stretched out beyond it, combined to make Arslan Tepe one of the typical sites chosen by the old people, and excavation might prove it to be the mother city of the townships, represented by mounds which were scattered over the lower ground. From Arslan Tepe we rode for 50 minutes to old Malatya, which has moved rapidly towards complete decay since it was deserted 70 years ago. The walls and bastions are dropping piecemeal into the poppy fields that fill the moat. Of the streets, little or nothing remains. The ruined mosques and tall minarets rise out of a sea of silvery poppy flowers. The Ulu Jami is still used for prayer, but its door was locked and the key was not to be procured. I climbed by its carved and half-ruined gateway onto the roof, and peering through the windows of the dome, saw that the interior was beautifully decorated with tiles and inscriptions. A rich store of fine Mohammedan work remains to be studied there. It was a 5 hours' ride across the plain to Ellamenjik, where our camp was pitched. Ellamenjik is a great breeding farm, the property of the late Sultan, who owned most of the pasture lands about Malatia. The population were in some distress at the prospect of a change of masters and the abolition of the privileges attached to the royal estate, and the government was confronted with a difficult problem with regard to the disposition of these domains. Few private persons could afford to pay the full price for the large breeding stables on the Sultan's farms, and the properties will lose much of their value when they lose the military guard that watched over the security of the royal mares. The solitude that will be a drawback when Ellamenjik comes into the market was a delightful advantage to our camping ground, and the people of Kharput must have been at their prayers again, for the rain fell in refreshing torrents, and, clearing away, left the broad plain and the unexplored peaks of the Dersim mountains shining in the sunset. Next morning we passed by another of the Sultan's farms, nestled among poplar trees in the midst of carefully hedged fields, and in 3 hours we came to Arga, where we called a halt while we changed septiers. I was well pleased at the delay, for it gave me opportunity to examine some elementary excavations which had been carried out by the Turkish government. They had uncovered the foundations of a church with a tessellated marble pavement, fragments of round columns and molded bases of excellent workmanship. That it was indeed a church I took on trust from the zaptier who acted as showman, for the aims of the excavators had not included the revelation of a plan, but the slabs carved with crosses bore out the official view. When he had exhibited all that was to be seen, he handed me over to one of his colleagues, who was to accompany us to Derendeh, with the parting injunction that he was to guide me to every ruin in the hills. "This Khanum," he observed, "likes ruins." "Effendim, O Lord," replied his interlocutor, "it shall be." But it was not. Perhaps there are no ruins where we crossed the Akche Dagh, or perhaps in the excitement of the road the zaptier forgot them as completely as I did. Our path would have done credit to the most sensational of journeys. It led us over wild and rocky hills and down into gorges incredibly deep and narrow, and when we stopped to draw breath at the bottom of one of these breakneck descents, we saw the track in front of us climbing mercilessly up the opposite precipice. We came to the bottom of the first valley at 11:45, about an hour from Arga. Deva Deresi is its name. At the top of the next ridge, the splendid gorge of the Lavandi Chai opened at our feet. With many warning cries to the baggage animals and much tugging at the taut bridles of our own mounts, for these passages had to be performed on foot, we reached the stream at 1:20, near to the Kurdish village of Levandiler. A steep climb brought us in another hour to the high village of Chatag. A quarter of an hour beyond it, we topped the pass and rode down by easy gradients to Levant. Here, surrounded by magnificent rocky hills, we pitched camp. Our hosts were men of the Kizilbash, a sect whose headquarters are in the Dersim. Their creed, which is much contemned by the Moslems, and not in words alone, is said to waver between paganism, Christianity, Manichaeanism, and Shi'ism, touched with some memories of ancient Anatolian cults. I did not attempt to unravel these mysteries during the evening I spent at Levant, but contented myself with inviting the head men of the village to a coffee party, on which simple human basis relations of the most cordial nature were established. The night was sharply cold, and we set out next morning, with numb fingers, to scramble down into the valley below Levant and up to the opposite ridge, which we reached in 1 hour. Above us towered the rocky plateau of the Kala Dagh, flanked on every side by cliffs, and below lay the wide and fertile valley of the Tokhma. The caravan pursued its way westward, but I turned east by Kurd Kui and Saman, and touched the river at Ozan, 4 hours from Levant, where my zaptier had promised me a ruin. "Ishte bu," said the headman of the village, pointing across the poppy fields. "Here it is." And he turned away to gather us a dish of ripe mulberries, while I stood in amazement before the Ionic columns and carved garlands of a little tomb that might have graced the Appian Way. There are no inscriptions upon it, nor anything to tell whose bones were laid within the vaulted chamber. I sent a greeting across the ages to the shade of him who had brought into this remote and inaccessible valley the arts of the West, and journeyed on. In 4 hours' ride by an easy path up the right bank of the Tokma-Su, we reached our camp, pitched near the village of Kotu Kala, which takes its name from a small ruined fort on the rock above it, and another 4 hours brought us next morning to DIYÄRBEKR. The town is scattered among gardens for close upon an hour's ride along the valley. Towards the upper end, a ruined castle stands upon a bold promontory of rock overhanging the stream. A staircase hewn in the precipice gave the defenders access to the water. On the further side, the hill slopes down more gently, and the ruins of a former DIYÄRBEKR lie about its foot. We marched 3 hours further and camped at Yazikui upon the grassy margin of the stream. The bare valley, with its ribbon of cultivation along the water's edge, gave us delightful traveling, but of archaeological interest there was nothing to be found, and when a native of Yazikui brought us information of ruins at some distance from our path, I engaged him joyfully to conduct us thither on the following morning. He led us into the hills to the north of the river by a fairly good road. It's the direct caravan road from Sivas to Albistan, and much frequented, and on to a wide pasturage, an hour and a half from Yazikui. The snows of Nurshak Dagh, southeast of Albistan, were visible from the huts of this alpine yaila. At its northern end we found a considerable quantity of shapeless ruins, mere heaps of unsquared stones, and among them 3 small tombs, half buried in the earth. They varied from 2 to 2.5 meters in length, by 1.2 to 2.2 meters in width, and were built of carefully dressed stones. Each had a door in one of the short sides, and each had been covered by a stone vault. In another hour and a half we came down to the Tokma Valley opposite the village of Tikmin. We passed through Telin and reached the Khan of Gorun in 2 hours more. There we halted to pick up fresh zaptiehs, and were greeted by the news that the zaptiehs were not ready and that the caravan had gone on unescorted. I had no mind to be parted from my tents upon an unknown road, and abandoning my intention of visiting a Hittite inscription in the gorge above Gorun, I posted after the muleteers with Yusuf at my heels. The path leaves the valley here and crosses some high ground, upon which, after an hour's hard riding, we caught up the caravan and were ourselves caught up, while we paused to lunch, by the zaptiehs. After we had passed a large chiflik belonging to the Sultan, we descended once more into the valley of the Tokma-Su at Osman Dedeli. We pitched camp above the village in a flowery meadow, through which hurried the Tokma-Su, a tiny flashing brook. On a rocky point above us were the ruins of a fort, with a Greek cross in a wreath cut upon the fallen lintel of its door. The end of Chapter 18. Section 19 of Amurath to Amurath. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Amurath to Amurath by Gertrude Bell. DIYÄRBEKR to Konia continued. We had now before us the roughest stage of our journey, for we'd reached the hills that part the waters tributary to the Euphrates from those that are tributary to the Sahuntha Persian Gulf from the Mediterranean. I cannot recommend the way we took across them, except for the beauty of the high and desolate pass. As soon as we'd climbed out of the valley of Osman Dedeli, we found ourselves on a wide upland, swept by cold airs and ringed about with mountains. The wheat was scarcely up, the grass sodden with newly melted snow, the peaks all white. In the midst of these fields lay Kupek Uren, a small hamlet near a mound which was covered with the building stones of an earlier time, while upon the slopes that closed the western end of the plateau was the village of Bey Bunar. Having passed the latter, we climbed into the hills by a shallow gorge down which flowed the headwaters of the Tokma-Su. Our way was decked with flowers. Daphne and androsace, veronica and dianthus grew among the rocks, and purple primulas edged the channel of the stream. The gullies were still full of snow. So we came to the water parting 2,040 to 2,070 meters above sea level, according to Kiepert, and, bidding farewell to the last source of the Mesopotamian rivers, rode down into the basin of the Mediterranean. The long, gently sloping meadows were rich in grass, but no flocks grazed there, and no summer villages were to be seen among the juniper bushes. The lonely beauty of these alpine pastures, where nature spreads out her fairest bounty, I beata sigode, fell upon us like a benison, and once again I offered up praise to all mountains. The water runnels gathered together into a small clear stream which rippled away from its birthplace in the green hollows, and plunged, we following it, into a pine-clad valley. The path grew steeper and more rocky as we descended, the valley narrower, until there was no place left free from pine and berberries and juniper but the boulder-strewn bed of the river. At length we were able to pull our horses up an exceedingly steep track through the pine woods, by which we emerged onto a grassy hillside. Here, by good fortune, we found a party of Circassians, who were hauling their bullock wagons, heavily loaded with timber, over ways which we reckoned to be hard going even for our baggage animals. They directed us to Boran-Dere-Kui. Before we had gone far, we rounded a spur, and the snowy peaks of Mount Argaeus swam into our ken, set in the midst of the Anatolian plateau. Boran-Dere-Kui is a Mohajir village, that is to say, it is peopled by Circassian immigrants from the Caucasus. They have filled the valley of the Zaman Tisu, and though they are not liked by the indigenous population, their coming has raised very sensibly the level of civilization. 40 years ago the Zamanti Valley was innocent of any settled habitation. The nomad Avshars drove their flocks up to it in the summer, sowed scanty crops, and left before the first winter snows. Now it is all under the plough, and the Circassian villages, with their osier beds and neat vegetable gardens, are scattered thickly along it. Nomad life dies out in a cultivated country, and the Avshars are settling into villages, though their houses are not so well built, nor their gardens so well kept as those of the Circassians. The chief town of the district is Azizia. There we changed zeptias, and I sat in the konak while the necessary arrangements were being made, and drank coffee with the officials. Presently there appeared one who was half a Negro, and told me his tale in the strong guttural Arabic of the desert. He was a native of the Hejaz. He had wandered up into this country before there were any villages in it, and had remained as a merchant. "It's very beautiful here," said I. "Yes," said he, "but the desert is different. I have not seen it for 40 years. And I understood what was in his heart. Behind the konak a plentiful spring bursts out from under the cliffs. I walked up to it and saw men digging up old walls in quest of cut stones. Fragments of columns and rude moldings pointed to the former presence of a church, and perhaps an earlier shrine hallowed, in true Anatolian fashion, the abundant source. From Azizia we turned our faces to Mount Argaeus and traveled along a well-laid road to Ekrek. Among the hills at some distance to the right of the road stands the castle of Mahmud Ghazi, magnificently placed upon a peak. My zaptieh told me that, in spite of its name, it was a Christian fortress, for he'd seen crosses carved upon the lintels, and only the distaste for further excursions that follows upon long stages of mountain travel prevented me from going up to it. I have a shrewd suspicion that it must be the Tsamandos of the Byzantine historians. Ekrek, where we pitched camp, is built in the bottom of one of the deep valleys, which are typical of the district about Argaeus. The lava, with which the plain is covered, forms a sharp cliff on either lip of these gorges, and in places the formation of the volcanic beds is so distinct that the lava can be seen lying like a solid pavement upon the soil, broken off at the edges of the valley and scattered down the slopes in huge slabs. Before I got into camp I turned off to see a small ruined church of no very great interest, and within the town there are several larger churches, all remodeled by the Armenian inhabitants. The early Christian architecture of the eastern side of Cappadocia was unknown to me except from books, and, finding myself in St. Basil's own country, I seized the opportunity of visiting some of the buildings which sprang up with the monastic impulse which he implanted. Instead of making straight for Caesarea, I rode next day under the slopes of the Colete Dach to the ruins of the Panagia above the village of Kopekli, and so to Tomarza, where there is one of the finest of the Cappadocian ruins. Both these buildings exhibit the Anatolian type of the domed cruciform, which was already familiar to me, but the decorative details, the engaged pilasters upon the outer walls, the elaborate moldings, the string courses carved over doors and windows, are not to be found in the churches that lie further to the west. I sat that night in the Armenian monastery where I was lodged, and pondered over the artistic tradition which these things revealed, and the mingling of Occidental with Oriental themes which they implied. Not far to the southeast of Tomarza stands among the hills the famous shrine of Komana, sacred to the goddess Ma. With its ancient Asiatic cult, and its temples constructed or reconstructed in the imperial period, Komana was one of the great meeting places of the culture of East and West. Its buildings must have exercised a strong influence over the architecture of eastern Cappadocia, and I determined to seek among its ruins evidences of the age that had preceded the early Christian. The Armenian priest, whose guest I was eager to relate to me the anxieties through which he and his congregation had passed during the last 2 months. Tomarza lay just beyond the zone of the recent outbreak, but at Shar, the village which occupies the site of Komana, there had been a masalach, an incident, though he did not enter into any particulars as to its character. It was evident that he regarded my interest in antiquities as a mere cloak, wherewith to cover a political purpose, and since I was not at the pains to undeceive him, if indeed it had been possible to make my aims clear to him, the announcement of my intention to visit Komana gave him yet stronger grounds for his conviction. By all Tomarza I was regarded as an itinerant missionary collecting evidence with regard to the massacre. The proximity of missionary schools was attested in varying degrees by the acquirements of the population. As I walked through the streets I was met by a young man who accosted me in French. "Vous parlez français?" said he. "Mais oui," said I. "Vous parlez bien?" he continued. "Très bien," I answered unblushingly, and he was obliged to take my word for it, for when I inquired whether he were a native of Tomarza, he could not understand until I repeated the question in Turkish. My next interlocutor was a boy who spoke English, which he had learnt, and learnt well, in an American college where he had taken his degree. He asked if he might know my name, and when I had obliged him in this particular, he begged that he might be told my object in coming to Tomarza. But I, being at the moment too busy with the ruins of the church to answer so many questions, replied that I had no object, and reduced him to a discomfited silence. The springs of action are different in American colleges. We left Tomarza at 10 o'clock, and journeyed into the hills by way of Suvagan, which we reached at 12:40. Almost immediately after we'd left the village, we entered a gorge, and our path climbed up through the pine woods to Kokorakaya, a small yaila near the top of the pass known as Gertrude Bell. Here we pitched camp at 5 in the afternoon, close under the snow wreaths that clung to the northern side of a rocky chain of peaks. Until sunset the clear, fresh notes of a cuckoo filled the alp, and all that he had to say was worth hearing. But I wondered whether he enjoyed the society of his brother the kite, whose thin, rippling cry dropped down from the rocks above him. I did not take my camp over the pass to Komana, but set out next day with Fateh and a zaptieh, and such simple provisions as might enable us to spend a night away from our tents if we found it necessary. Before we started I covenanted with the zaptieh, who was unusually pious, that prayers should be suspended for the day, the previous day's journey having been seriously upset by the occurrence of the Asr, the hour of afternoon prayer, though every one knows that there is a special dispensation with regard to travelers. The long grassy pass opens onto a confused prospect of desolate mountains and hardly less deserted valleys, the gnarled and twisted pine woods clinging to the rocks, the flowering hawthorn and regiments of yellow mullein that lined the lower course of the stream, gave to our road a memorable beauty, and if the going was not so good as might have been desired, why, we'd seen worse. In the midst of these wild solitudes, 5 hours from Kokorakaya, we came upon a ruined shrine. It was a temple mausoleum, and in this respect the true forerunner of the memorial churches of the Anatolian plateau. Nor did the connection between the Christian and the pagan work cease here. The shallow engaged pilasters, broken by a molding into 2 stories, which are found in the churches, were present in the temple. If the string courses did not yet form a continuous band over the window arches, it was easy to see how obvious the transition to the later type would be, and the character of the profiles was the same here as in the churches. The lower part of the temple contained a vault filled with loculi. The eastern end of the upper floor was ruined and overgrown with thick brushwood, but I have no doubt that it could be disengaged and planned without difficulty. Some clearing away of earth and shrubs would be required before it would be possible to make out the nature of a building, indicated by masses of dressed stones and broken columns, which was placed immediately to the south of the temple, but the ruins standing above ground were an exceedingly instructive link in the chain of Cappadocian architecture, and I rode down to Shahar full of hope. The village lies in the heart of a valley cut out by the Goksu, a tributary of the Saihun. Its sheltered fields were covered with corn, its gardens planted with fruit trees, but the streets and houses were no less ruined than the temples of the great goddess. The hot breath of massacre had passed down the smiling vale and left Shire a heap of ashes. I found the inhabitants huddled together on a bluff, where half a dozen of their dwellings had escaped destruction. A young schoolmaster from the American College of Tarsus told me the story in my own tongue. He was himself a native of Shire, and chance had brought him back to his home shortly before the outbreak at Adana and Tarsus. Of this disaster, which began on April 14, the people of Shire had received no information until on April 20, the Kurds, Turks, and Circassians from the neighboring Muslim villages appeared in arms and announced that they did not intend to leave a single Christian alive. The villagers of Shire had 80 rifles among them. Thus armed, they defended the bluff, on which stand the ruins of the chief shrine of Ma, for 9 days, at the end of which time tardy help arrived from Azizia. They had not lost a life, but they had been powerless to prevent the destruction of the village and the valley. Every house was looted and burnt. Of the bazaars nothing remained but blackened foundations. The charred beams of the bridge had fallen into the stream, and the only wall that yet stood in the low ground was a splendid fragment of ancient masonry facing the river. "Why," said I, gazing upon the ruined heaps that had once been the schoolmaster's house, "did they spare the fruit trees and the corn?" "They thought that we should be dead before the corn was ripe," he answered, "and they meant to reap it for themselves. Also the fruit trees they looked on as their own. Besides these we have nothing left, and we are so much troubled by hunger." They were as much troubled by the thought that they could not offer me a fitting hospitality. The Oda, the village guest chamber, was in ashes, and the few houses on the bluff were crowded with women and children. But there was nothing to detain me. The ancient buildings had suffered with the modern. The inscribed stones and acanthus capitals, relics of a golden past, which had decked the streets of the bazaar, lay blackened and half buried among the ruins, and after I had made a brief survey of the site, I handed over to the schoolmaster the little money that was in my purse, and turned back across the hills. The dusk gathered about us as we climbed up to the pass, but the road that we had followed so gaily in the morning was full of darker shadows than those of night. "Nature, red in tooth and claw with ravine," cried out from riven crag and blasted pine. Mountain and valley joined in her chorus, strophe to antistrophe. Mercilessly she creates and destroys. The fury of the storm, the sharp blade of the frost, the senseless passions of mankind are alike of her ordering. The ruins of Shire were the sole evidence which I saw with my own eyes of the far-reaching havoc wrought by the outbreak at Adana, but before I reached Konia I had opportunity to judge of its lasting effect. In Caesarea, trade was paralyzed by the economic annihilation of the rich province of Cilicia, as well as by the fear of further disturbances. The massacres had struck terror into the heart of Moslem and of Christian. They extinguished for a time the new-born hopes of peace, and roused once more the hatred between creed and creed which the authors of the Constitution had undertaken to allay. Every section of the community suffered from a destruction of confidence, which is even more disastrous than the destruction of wealth, though the Armenians suffered incomparably the most. But the fact that they bore a penalty out of proportion to their fault does not acquit them of blame. They had helped to bring upon themselves the calamity that overwhelmed them. By wild oratory they had laid themselves open to the accusations of conspiracy which were brought against them. They had kindled the flames of discord by preaching in their churches the obligation of revenge. The criminal folly of their utterances stirred up vague alarms in the breasts of an ignorant and fanatical population, and from whatever side came the incitement to outrage, it came to ears sharpened by anxiety. But it must be remembered that in several instances catastrophe was averted by the prompt action of the officials who controlled the threatened districts. In Caesarea, the Mutsarif, rather than allow a repetition of the Adana tragedy, ordered his soldiers to fire upon the Muslim crowd, who clamored about the serai for arms on the plea that their lives were in danger from the Christians, and his uncompromising attitude brought the town to order. The Kaimakam of Aregli patrolled the streets night after night during a week of panic. The Mutsarif of Kozan drove back the armed bands of Circassians who had marched down from the mountains bent on slaughter. Wherever it became evident that the government was not on the side of disorder, disorder was nipped in the bud, and I heard of one example where a handful of Turkish soldiers held in check many hundreds of Kurds, and the Christian village which they had assembled to destroy escaped untouched. I believe that no great massacre has taken place in Turkey without the encouragement of the central authority, or a passivity which amounts to connivance on the part of the local officials. A strong valley backed by an enlightened government would keep peace in the most fanatical province of the empire. On our way back to Tamarza we passed a large encampment of Afshars. The tents of these Turkish nomads are of a pattern which is common to nearly all the tribes of Central Asia, but entirely different from that of the Arabs. They are round, with a domed roof of felt supported on bent withes, and the sides are of plaited rushes over which a woolen curtain is hung when the nights are cold. We did not sleep a second night at Tamarza, but marched a couple of hours further upon the road to Caesarea, and camped at the village of Mardin, which lies in a cleft of the lava beds under the twin peaks of Mount Argaeus. Next day we skirted the flanks of the great volcano, passed by the ruined Sari Khan, and under the small peak of Alidhak, which is, so I was credibly informed by my zaptier, nothing but a stray boulder, dropped by Ali ibn Abi Talib when he was engaged in helping the Prophet to pile up the huge mass of Argaeus. Not only the geographical features of the land, but also the physical and moral qualities of the inhabitants of Caesarea came under our consideration as we rode. If a serpent bites a man of Caesarea, observed Feta, the serpent dies. Yanum! Exclaimed the zaptier, who was not a Caesarean. My soul, they can outwit the devil himself. Have you not heard the tale? I have not heard, said Feta. This is it, said the zaptier. Upon a day the devil came to Caesarea. Kush Gildi, said the people, a fair welcome. And they showed him the streets and the bazaars of the city, the mosques and the khans, all of them. When he was hungry they set food before him till he was well satisfied. But when he rose to depart he looked for his cloak and belt, and they were gone. The devil is not safe from the thieves of Caesarea. God made them rogues, said Feta. What can we do? Observed the zaptier philosophically. Dunya bir yanum, the world is all one. Great travelling they make, continued Feta, in every city you meet them. Zaptier was ready with historic evidence on this head also. There was a man, said he, who lived some time in Caesarea, and having had experience of the people, he found them all to be pigs. Therefore he resolved to journey to the furthest end of the earth, that he might escape from them. And he went to Baghdad, which is a long road. It is long, admitted Feta. And then he entered the bath, and demanded a good hammamji to knead the weariness out of his bones. And the owner of the bath called out, Bring the lame Caesarean. Then said the traveller, A Caesarean here, and he lame? And he fled from Baghdad. Feta is innocent of any sense of humor. Oh, merciful, said he gravely. I do not know whether it was the effect produced by these tales which prevented me from lodging in Caesarea, or whether the prospect of 2 days spent in the society of people of my own speech and civilization would not have proved too strong a temptation, even if the Caesareans had shone with every virtue. At any rate, I went no further than Talas, and there remained as a guest in the hospital of the American missionaries. And if I saw little of the famous city of Caesarea, I passed many hours in the hospital garden at the feet of men and women whose words were instinct with a wise tolerance and weighted by a profound experience of every aspect of Oriental life. Caesarea was the end of the caravan journey. In 2 days we had sold our horses, one for us to sell and one for them to buy, said Feta, and packed our belongings into the carts which were to take us to the railway at Areyi. I rode down from Talas to conclude these arrangements, and to visit the citadel which stands on Justinian's foundations. The interior is now packed with narrow streets, the houses being built partly of ancient materials. The fragments of columns and the weather-worn capitals which are embedded in the walls of the houses were derived either from the early Christian town, which occupied the site of modern Caesarea, or from ancient Caesarea, which lay upon the lower slopes of Mount Argaeus. A few foundations outside the limits of the present town are all that remain of the churches that adorn the greatest ecclesiastical center of the Anatolian plateau, the birthplace of St. Basil, but the memory of the Seljuk conquerors, who gave it a fresh glory during the Middle Ages, is still preserved in many a decaying mosque and school. We set out from Caesarea a diminished party, Haj Amr and Selim having found work with a caravan of muleteers, and returned with them across the mountains to Aleppo. The first day's drive took us round the foot of Argaeus to Yeni Khan, a solitary inn not marked in Kiepert, which lies 2 hours to the north of Karahisar. The mighty buttresses of Argaeus, rising out of the immense flats of the Anatolian plateau, are as imposing as the flanks of Etna, rising from the sea, and its height, over 13,000 feet, is scarcely less from base to summit than that of the Sicilian volcano. The second day brought us to a khan by the roadside, half an hour from the village of Andaval. Upon the following morning we reached, after 3/4 of an hour's drive, the church of Constantine, of which the foundation is attributed by legend to the Empress Helena, and in 2 hours more we came to Nigde, where I halted for a few hours to see the Seljuk mosques and tombs for which the town is famed. Of these, the most beautiful is the so-called mausoleum of Havanda, the wife of Alai-ad-Din. It's in ground plan an octagon, but above the windows the number of faces is doubled, the additional angles being built over projecting brackets, finely worked with stalactite ornaments. The spandrels above the windows are decorated with pairs of sphinxes, and the door is framed in a delicate tracery of lace-like patterns. Beyond Bor we came into a well-known country dominated by the twin peaks of Hasan Dagh, the lesser Argaeus, which I greeted with a respect mingled with the familiarity born of an intimate acquaintance with its rocks. 3 hours from Nigde we reached Emir Chiflik, where there is a khan unnamed by Kiepert, and next morning we drove into Bulyurlu, the present terminus of the Baghdad railway. But the art of modern travel accords ill with the habits of the East. The baggage wagon missed the daily train, and we were obliged to wait for it at Arayi. "Your Excellency does not wish to see the pictures of the Beni Hitt?" said Fateh suspiciously as we stepped out upon the platform. We had never before passed through Arayi without visiting the great Hittite relief in the gorge of Ivriz, but I reassured him we had seen enough. One more expedition lay, however, between us and Konia. It was to be accomplished in light order. Indeed, we might have ridden up to the Karadagh without possessions, for there was no man in all the mountain who would not have been proud to offer us a lodging. Fateh and I shone there with a reflected glory that radiated from the Chalabi, whose fame is not confined to the Karadagh, though few perhaps of his colleagues in the Scottish Academe which he adorns would recognize him under his Anatolian title. Had we not spent weeks under his direction, in grubbing among old stones to the delight and profit of all beholders? Had we not consumed innumerable hares and partridges at 2d. a head, and offered a sure market for yogurt and eggs? And when the regretted hour of departure arrived, what store of empty tins and battered cooking pots was left behind to keep our memory green? Our renown extended even to Karaman, where we alighted from the train on the following evening. The Khanji was a trusted friend. The shopkeepers pressed gifts of rose jam upon us, and when the hiring of horses presented a difficulty, I had only to step out into the streets and explain our needs to the first acquaintance whom I met. He happened to be a hamal, a porter, who had done a couple of days' work for us in the Karadagh, and he was intimate with an Arabaji, a carriage driver, who would, without doubt, place his horses at our disposal, and if I would come in and drink a cup of coffee, the matter should be settled. I accepted the invitation and was introduced triumphantly to the hamal's wife. "This is the maid I told you about, she who worked with the Chalabi." On our way back to the Khan we chanced to pass by the exquisite Khatunya Madrasa, and since the mullah was standing under the carved gateway, I stopped to bid him a good evening. In the tomb chamber that opens out of the cloistered courtyard, I remembered to have seen fragments of a fine inscription of blue tiles. Scarcely a tile was left upon the walls, and I knew how they had vanished, for I had found one of them in the hands of a Konia dealer, and bought it from him. This incident I related to the mullah. "You did very wrong," said he. "You have stolen one of our tiles and carried it away." "I did not steal it," I pleaded weakly. "I found it at Konia." "It is all one," he replied. "You should give it back." But as we went out through the cloister I noticed that the columns which supported it were double columns of a type peculiar to Christian architecture. They had, in all probability, been removed from a church. "Mullah Effendi," said I, "we are equal. I have taken a tile out of your Muslim tomb, and you the columns from our Christian church." The mullah's indignation vanished in a flash. "Aferin!" he cried with a jolly laugh. "Bravo!" and he clapped me on the back. The hamal's confidence in the Arabaji had not been misplaced. We set out next morning for the Karadagh, and every mile was full of delightful reminiscence. The yellow roses dropped their petals in familiar fashion over the mountain path. Mullein and borage spread their annual carpet of blue and gold between the ruins, and the peak of Mahalech, on which I had found a Hittite inscription, and a Christian monastery, stood guardian as of old over the green cup wherein had lain an ancient city. The sturdy Yuriks came striding down from their high yailas to bid us a joyful coming and a slow departure. Many were the greetings that passed round the campfire, and it was well that Fatah had laid in a good provision of coffee at Karaman. So, on a hot morning, we struck our last camp and rode down the northern slopes of the mountain to rejoin the railway by which we were to travel to Konia. And as we crossed the level plain, Fatah observed with satisfaction, "The cornland has increased since 2 years ago. Effendim, there is twice as much sown ground." "Praise God," said I, "it is the doing of the railway." "Wherever it passes the corn springs up," said Fatah. "Mashallah, Konia will become a great city." "It has grown in our knowledge," said I, "but this year we shall find it much changed, for all our friends have left." "Where have they gone?" inquired Fatah. "Riza Beg is in Salonika," said I, mentioning one who had eaten out his heart in exile for 10 weary years. "He has gone back to his wife and child." "He would make haste to join them," assented Fatah. "And Mehmet Pasha is in Constantinople. I saw his name among those who helped to depose the Sultan." "He has risen to high honor," said Fatah. Mehmet Pasha was another of the proscribed. "And Suleiman Effendi is deputy for Konia, where he was so long in exile. Oh, Fatah, we shall be strangers there now that our friends have gone." "Your Excellency will meet them in other cities," said Fatah, "and they will be free men." The end of section 19. The end of Amurath to Amurath by Gertrude Bell.